Daniel Colton woke up because something was missing, not a sound, the absence of one, for 9 years. Every morning on this land had started the same way, wind through the wheat. Dry, steady pull of air across the stalks that he heard before he was fully awake. The way you heard your own breathing without deciding to listen for it. It was the sound of the field being a field, of the land doing what land was supposed to do. That morning, there was nothing. He lay still for a moment. The rain was still on the roof. That part had not changed. But beneath it, where the field should have been, there was only a low, flat silence that did not belong to any morning he had known here. He got up, pulled on his boots without lighting the lamp, walked through the dark kitchen to the back door and opened it. The field was gone, not damaged, not flooded the way a field flooded after a hard rain, with water sitting shallow in the low places, while the rows still showed through. Gone. From the back step to the tree line to the hills beyond, there was only water, brown and wide and flat, carrying things he could not immediately name. A wooden barrel, a coil of rope, 3 chickens, dead, turning slowly in the current, and a red chair he had never seen before in his life, moving south at a steady pace, belonging to someone somewhere upstream who had lost considerably more than a chair. He stood in the open doorway and let the cold come in. The rain tapped at his shoulders. The water below the step made a sound against the foundation of the house, a soft and patient sound, the sound of something that had already decided where it was going and was not in any hurry because it had already arrived. He could not see the fence line. He could not see the road. He could not see the roof of Eli Marsh's place, which had been visible from this door on every clear morning for 9 years. A fixed point at the edge of the property, the way a landmark became part of how you knew where you were. There was no landmark now. There was only the water, and above it, the gray sky, and at the far edge of everything the dark shape of the Sierra Nevada still rising out of the valley like it always had. Unchanged, indifferent, as if what had happened down here in the night was not its concern. Margaret's voice came from the staircase behind him. Daniel. He did not turn around. What do you see out there? He tried to find the words for it. He had been a man who worked with his hands for 20 years, and he knew the language of physical things, of soil and timber and weather, but there was no word in anything he knew for what was sitting outside his back door that morning. The field was gone. The road was gone. The fence was gone. The marsh place was gone. His wheat, which he had cut and stored in September, and which represented everything the year had been, was in the barn, which was in the water, which went on for as far as he could see. He turned around. Margaret was standing at the top of the stairs. Behind her, James, 14 years old, was already awake and watching. Somewhere down the hall, Clara was still sleeping. 8 years old and still sleeping. And for one moment Daniel was grateful for that. Grateful she was not standing here looking at what he was looking at, because he did not yet know how to explain it. He looked at his wife. She looked at him. Get the tin box, he said. Get the blankets. Wake the children. She did not ask why. She had been waiting for those words for 3 weeks. She just turned and went. By the time it was over, 11 families in the surrounding valley would be gone. Some would come back. Most would not. The Coltons were not gone yet, but the morning that would decide it had already begun. 8 weeks earlier, the field was full. It was the first week of November, 1861, and the Sacramento Valley was doing what it did in the fall, which was settle into itself after the long, dry summer. The light going gold and thin, the mornings carrying a chill that the afternoons burned off by 10. The wheat had come in well, better than the year before, better, Daniel thought, than any year since he had broken this ground. He was standing at the edge of the north field when he thought this. He did it the way he always confirmed things he believed, which was to reach down and take a fistful of the soil and hold it. He pressed his thumb into it, felt the grain of it, the give of it, the particular way it held together when compressed and fell apart when released. There was a lot you could learn about land this way, more than you could learn from looking at it. He had spent 9 years learning to read this soil with his hands, and he trusted what it told him. This was good land. It had taken a long time to become good land, and it had cost him most of what he had. But it was his, and it was good, and those two facts together were the foundation of everything. He let the soil fall behind him. The barn was full, 47 sacks of wheat, stored and dry, representing 4 months of work across planting and growing and cutting and threshing. In the house, Margaret had her ledger open on the kitchen table with the numbers written in her careful hand. And those numbers told a story Daniel preferred to hear in her voice rather than read himself, because when she read them aloud, they sounded like something real, like something that had been earned. He walked back toward the house. James was at the east fence, replacing a post that had rotted through at the base. 14, and already with the habit of working without being told, which was a thing Daniel had not needed to teach because the boy had grown up watching and had simply absorbed it the way children absorbed everything, without knowing they were learning. James saw his father coming and straightened up and held the post with both hands to show the work he had done. Daniel nodded. The boy nodded back. That was most of their conversations that fall. Clara was in the yard, chasing the chickens away from the barn door. She was 8, and she approached the chickens with a ferocity they had long since learned to respect, waving her arms and making a sound that was somewhere between a word and a honk, entirely her own invention, which worked better than anything Daniel had tried. He watched her for a moment. She caught him watching and grinned, and went back to the chickens. Inside, Margaret was at the table. She was a woman who did not look up from what she was working on until she was done with it. So Daniel poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot on the stove and sat down across from her and waited. She had come to California in 1853, alone on a ship from New York, around the Horn. 6 months on water before she ever saw the land he had been writing to her about. He had spent a year on this property before she arrived. He had built the house and broken the first field and written her letters describing what it looked like, what it smelled like in the morning, what he thought it could become. She had read those letters in Ohio, and then she had gotten on the ship. He had always considered that the bravest thing he had ever witnessed, and he had never said so because she would have told him that brave was the wrong word, that she had simply made a decision and then followed through on it, which was what decisions required. She looked up from the ledger. If the wheat price holds through spring, she said. "We can buy the 20 acres north of the creek. You think it will hold?" She looked back at the ledger. "I wrote it both ways." She turned the book so he could see. 2 columns. One if the price held, one if it dropped. Both columns showed numbers that were better than the year before. He looked at the columns, and then he looked at his wife, and he thought, not for the first time, that the bravest thing he had ever witnessed was not the ship under the floorboards near the kitchen wall, in a tin box that Margaret had brought from Ohio, were $47 in cash. A photograph of her parents taken in Cork before they came to America. The deed to 80 acres of Sacramento Valley farmland, and a silver ring she no longer wore, because her hands had changed in 9 years of farming, and the ring no longer fit. She had not told Daniel the ring no longer fit. She did not know why she had not told him. She just had not. That tin box was the first thing she would reach for. She did not know that yet. Sitting in the lamplight, with the ledger open in front of her. On an evening in early November, when the weather was warm and the barn was full, and California believed, completely and without reservation, in itself, the knock at the door came late in the afternoon. Eli Marsh, 55 years old. In California, since the rush of '49, their nearest neighbor, and the only man Daniel knew who had arrived before him. He had seen things go wrong on this land that Daniel had not yet lived long enough to see. He came in and sat at the corner of the table and accepted a cup of coffee and held it in both hands. They talked about the price of wheat, about the railroad, which everyone was talking about Sacramento, which was putting up new brick buildings on K Street. California was growing. California believed in itself, the way a young man believed in himself after his first real success. Completely, and without the benefit of having yet seen what could go wrong. At some point, Eli set his cup down and looked out the window at the sky. "Wet winter coming," he said. "Always wet in winter," Daniel said. "Wetter than usual." Eli looked at the sky the way men looked at things. They knew how to read. "I have seen it before." Not often. He did not say what he had seen. He picked up his cup and finished his coffee and said good night and walked home in the early dark. Daniel watched him go from the door. The evening was warm for November. To avoid him, he went inside. Clara was already asleep. James was reading by the lamp. Margaret had closed the ledger and was knitting, the needles moving in the particular rhythm she fell into when she was not thinking about her hands. He sat by the fire, and he thought about Eli's face when he looked at the sky. The particular quality of it. The look of a man who had seen something before and was seeing the signs of it again. He told himself it was probably nothing. He was wrong about that. He would know it soon enough. The first rain came on a Saturday in late November. Daniel was at the barn when it started. A light rain, the kind that arrived in the Sacramento Valley every winter without announcement and without apology. The kind that lasted a day or two and then moved on. He finished what he was doing, pulled his coat tighter, and walked back to the house. He did not think about the rain again that evening. There was no reason to. The next morning it was still raining. That was fine. 2 days was common. 3 days happened. Margaret made soup from what was in the larder, and James sat at the table with his school book, and Clara stood at the window watching the yard turn to mud, with the focused attention she gave to things she found genuinely interesting. Daniel sharpened tools in the barn. The work that could not be done outside could be prepared for the time when it could. On the fourth day, the rain changed, not harder, not softer. It changed in quality, in the way it came down, shifting from something intermittent and familiar into something steadier and more committed, as if it had made a decision somewhere up in the clouds and was now following through on it. Daniel noticed this but did not remark on it. Margaret noticed it and wrote a single line in the margin of her ledger, just the date and the word continuing, and then went back to her numbers. Week 2 arrived without the rain leaving. The yard was fully mud now, the kind that pulled at boots and filled in footprints before you had taken 3 steps past them. The road to Sacramento was soft in a way that made Daniel choose not to test it. The American River, visible from the east side of the property on clear days, had risen enough that its color had changed, going from the clear, shallow green of a river in its banks to the brown and opaque color of a river that was carrying more than it was used to carrying. Daniel went to check the east fence on the 14th day. He came back with mud to his knees and said nothing at dinner. That night, he went to the barn and began moving the heavier tools to the highest shelves. The seed stock for spring planting he moved to the loft. He worked by lamplight for 2 hours and came back inside and hung up his coat and sat down. And the house looked exactly as it had when he left. Margaret was at the table. James was half asleep over his book. Clara was already in bed. He did not explain what he had been doing. He did not explain because saying it aloud would make it real in a way he was not ready for. And because he was still telling himself he was probably wrong. And because there was a part of him that had been a farmer long enough to know that preparing for the worst was not the same as expecting it. He sat by the fire and listened to the rain, and after a while he went to bed. A man named Pullman, who drove the mail between Sacramento and the eastern farms, came through on a gray afternoon in the middle of December. He was wet through to the center of himself, his horse moving with the careful deliberation of an animal that had been on soft ground too long. He accepted coffee without being asked and sat by the stove and told them what he had seen. The Sacramento River was the highest he had seen it in 10 years. The Levee crews were out, piling sandbags along the weak sections north of the city. In San Francisco, the rain had set a record for December. From the mining camps up in the Sierra Nevada foothills, word had come down that several of the access roads were washed out. Nothing dramatic, Pullman said, just roads gone soft and impassable. The kind of thing that happened in bad winters and was repaired in spring. Daniel listened to all of this without speaking. Pullman finished his coffee and stood up and thanked Margaret and went back out into the rain. They listened to his horse move away down the road, the hoofbeats going soft and then silent. Clara asked if Mr. Pullman was cold. Margaret said he was probably used to it. Clara thought about this and said she did not think you could get used to being that wet. Margaret said that was probably true. That night the rain changed again, late, after everyone else was asleep. Daniel became aware of a different sound underneath the rain, not coming from the roof, but from somewhere outside and to the east. He lay still and listened. Water moving on flat ground, not a creek, not a river in its banks. Water spreading across ground that was not a riverbed, finding its own level the way water always did, when there was too much of it and nowhere left to go. He recognized the sound the way you recognized something you had been warned about but never encountered. He got up. He took the lamp and went to the east window and held it up. In the lamplight, at the edge of the glass, he could see water moving in the field. Shallow, an inch or two. Dark and very calm, spreading evenly in every direction from the low point near the eastern fence. He stood there for a long time. Then he went back to bed. He lay on his side, facing the wall, and listened to the rain. And below the rain, the water. And below the water, the absolute certainty that whatever this was, it was not going to resolve itself by morning. He did not sleep again. He did not tell Margaret. He would think about that later. The things he did not say in those weeks. He had told himself he was protecting her from worry that might turn out to be unnecessary. That was partly true, but partly it was something else. Something closer to the fact that the moment he said it aloud, the life they had been building here became something that could be taken away, and he was not ready for that to be true yet. On the morning of December 17th, Daniel walked out to the barn and found 3 inches of water on the floor. He stood in the doorway and looked at it. The wheat sacks were dry. He had moved them to the loft. The tools were on the high shelves. He had done all of that in the dark without telling anyone. He went back inside. Margaret was at the stove. She looked at his boots. At the waterline, on the leather. She did not say anything. She poured him a cup of coffee and set it on the table. He sat down. "The barn floor has water," he said. She nodded. She had already known. He could see it in the nod. The particular economy of it. The nod of a woman confirming something she had already written in the margin of her ledger. "How high?" she said. 3 inches. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I will check the larder." She went to the larder, and he heard her moving things. He drank his coffee and listened to the rain, and outside, the chickens were making the sound chickens made when they were unhappy. A sound Daniel had heard 1,000 times. A sound that now, for reasons he could not explain, was the most unsettling thing he had heard all week. Outside, the water in the east field was still spreading. It had somewhere to go. It was going there. Here is something most people living in the Sacramento Valley in the winter of 1861 did not know. The rain falling on their farms and fields and city streets was one problem. But 80 miles to the east, something else was happening that would turn a bad winter into something no one in California had a name for. It had been a heavy snow year in the Sierra Nevada. The mountains had spent November and early December collecting snow. The snowpack building on the high slopes the way it did every year, storing water in frozen form the way a dam stored it in liquid form. In an ordinary winter, this snow would melt slowly through spring, feeding the rivers at a manageable rate, keeping the valleys green without flooding them. This was not an ordinary winter. The rain that was falling on the Sacramento Valley was also falling on the Sierra Nevada. And it was warm. Warm in a way that December rain in the mountains was not supposed to be warm. Warm enough to fall as rain rather than snow. Warm enough to land on the existing snowpack and instead of adding to it, begin to melt it. What was happening on those slopes was invisible from the valley floor. You could not see it from Daniel Colton's back porch. You could not see it from Sacramento. But it was happening. The snow that had been sitting on those slopes since October was releasing. The water had to go somewhere. It went into the rivers. The American River. The Sacramento River. The Feather River. The San Joaquin River. Every river that ran from the Sierra Nevada into the Central Valley was receiving more water in those weeks than it had been built by nature to carry. They carried it anyway, because rivers had no choice. They did not negotiate with the mountains that fed them. Daniel could see the American River from the east side of his property on days when the rain slowed enough to see any distance at all. What he saw was not the river he knew. The river he knew was 100 yards wide at its fullest, clear running and fast. What he saw now was something wider and darker and moving with a different quality, a heaviness, a volume expressed not in speed but in mass. The way a crowd moved differently than a single person. Even when both were walking, he watched it from the fence line on the morning of December 18th. Eli Marsh came to the fence from the other side. He had walked across his own fields, which were soft enough now that his boots left deep prints that filled with water behind him. He stood at the fence and looked at the river with Daniel, and neither of them said anything for a while. Then Eli said, "You know what is happening up there. Snow is melting." Daniel said, "All of it." Eli said, "At once." Daniel looked at the river. "I have been here since 49. Eli said, "I have seen wet winters. I have seen the river come up. In 52, it came up enough to put water in my south field for a week." He paused. "This is not that. How do you know?" Eli was quiet for a moment. "In 52, the rain was cold. Rain cold enough that what fell on the mountains stayed snow. This rain is not cold." He looked up at the sky. "When the rain is warm and the snow is already up there, you do not get a high river. You get something else. What do you get?" Eli looked at him. "I have only heard about it. Older men than me. Men who were here in the 30s and 40s. Before there was a California to speak of. They talked about winters like this. What they described." He stopped. He pulled his coat tighter. They did not have good words for it either. He went home. Daniel stood at the fence for a while longer. He was doing the mathematics of it in his head, the way a farmer did mathematics. Not with numbers on paper, but with observations accumulated over years. He knew how much water fell in a normal December. He knew how high the river ran in a normal wet winter. He knew where his land sat relative to the river, how many feet of elevation he had between his house and the riverbank. The mathematics did not come out to a number that reassured him. That evening, Eli came to the house. He sat down and accepted the coffee Margaret poured, and held the cup in both hands and looked at the table for a while. Clara was doing her letters at the other end of the table. James was somewhere in the back of the house. The rain on the roof had been the constant background of every conversation for 3 weeks, and no one mentioned it anymore. The way you did not mention the sound of your own heartbeat. "I want to tell you something," Eli said. He was talking to Daniel, but he said it loud enough that Margaret could hear from the stove. "Not to scare you, because you should know." "All right," Daniel said. "I have been watching the river for 30 years. I know what it looks like when it is thinking about leaving its banks, and I know what it looks like when it has already decided." He set his cup down. "It has decided." The kitchen was quiet, except for the rain. Clara looked up from her letters. She had been listening. The way children listen to adult conversations, they were not meant to hear. Absorbing the weight, without necessarily understanding the content. "Ele," she said, "is the river going to come here?" Eli looked at her. He was a man who did not lie to children. "I think it might," he said. Clara considered this with the seriousness she brought to most things. "Will it come inside?" "I do not know," Eli said. "That is why I am here. So your father and mother have time to think about it." Clara looked at her father. Daniel looked at his daughter. 8 years old. Born in California. Never seen a winter this heavy. She knew every corner of this farm, the way children knew their whole world. When their whole world was 80 acres and a farmhouse and a barn, she knew which boards in the floor creaked. She knew where the barn cat slept in winter. This was her home, the only home she had ever known. He looked at Eli. "How much time do you think we have?" Eli picked up his cup. "A week. Maybe less, depending on what the rain does." He finished his coffee and said good night and walked home through the dark. Daniel sat at the table after he left and listened to the rain and tried to hear, underneath it, the sound of the river. He thought he could. A low presence at the edge of everything. The sound of a very large amount of water, moving very steadily toward a place it had already decided to go. Margaret sat down across from him. She opened her ledger to a fresh page. She wrote the date at the top. Then she began a list, without being asked, without consulting him, because she had already been making this list in her head for days. What to move to the upper floor, what to move to the loft, what to carry if they had to leave quickly, what they could not carry and would have to leave behind. She wrote in her careful hand while the rain came down. Daniel watched her write and thought about the 80 acres outside and the 9 years it had taken to make them what they were. He thought about the red chair. He had not seen it yet, but it was already out there somewhere. Upstream, already in the water, already moving south. He just did not know it yet. Tomorrow would be a different kind of day. He could feel it the way he felt changes in the weather, in the pressure of the air, in the particular quality of the silence between one raindrop and the next. He was right about that. The evening of January 9th, 1862, was ordinary in the way that last ordinary things always were. Margaret made supper from what was in the larder: salt, pork, and potatoes. Bread from 2 days before that she had wrapped in cloth to keep. They ate at the table the way they always ate. Clara talking more than anyone else. James answering in the short sentences of a boy who had things on his mind he had not yet learned to say out loud. Daniel ate and listened and said the things that were required of him and did not say the other things. The things he had been carrying for 3 weeks, like stones in his coat pockets, growing heavier each day, without anyone else being able to see the weight. After supper, he went out to check the water level in the yard. It was dark and raining, and he carried the lamp low so it lit the ground rather than the sky. The water was at the second board of the back step. That morning it had been at the first board. He stood there and watched it for a moment, and then he went back inside and hung up his coat and said nothing about what he had seen. "The Levee crews are still out," James said from across the room. He had gotten this from Pullman, the mail carrier, who had come through that afternoon looking like a man who had been submerged and then partially dried and then submerged again. Pullman said they have been out 3 days straight. "Good," Daniel said. He said, "There are a lot of people in Sacramento moving things to their upper floors. That is sensible. James looked at his father with the particular look of a 14-year-old who understood that the conversation he was being given was not the conversation that was available. He looked at his father, and then at his mother, and then back at the book in front of him, and said nothing else. Margaret cleared the table. Daniel sat by the fire. Clara fell asleep in her chair, the way she sometimes did, going from fully awake to fully asleep in the time it took to turn a page. And Daniel carried her upstairs and put her in her bed and stood in the doorway of her room for a moment, listening to her breathe, listening to the rain on the roof above her. He went back downstairs. He sat by the fire until Margaret had finished in the kitchen and come to sit across from him with her knitting. They sat together in the way of people who had spent 20 years in rooms together. The silence between them, the comfortable kind that did not require filling, except that tonight it was not entirely comfortable, because Daniel was sitting inside a weight of knowing that he had not yet figured out how to share. On the kitchen table, Margaret's ledger sat closed. 9 years of careful numbers in that book. Everything they had done and spent and earned and owed. The entire record of what they had been trying to build. Written in her hand on every page. "I am going to sleep," Margaret said eventually. "I will be up," he said. She looked at him for a moment with the look she had, the one that said she knew the difference between his silences. "All right," she said. She went upstairs. He sat alone by the fire and listened to the rain. At some point, he must have slept because something pulled him out of sleep that was not the rain. He was in the chair, the fire low, the lamp guttered down. The house was dark and quiet. He sat still and listened. The rain was still on the roof, but beneath it, or behind it, there was another sound, low and continuous and directional, the sound of water moving across flat ground with purpose. Water that had somewhere to be and was going there. Water that was no longer waiting. He stood up. He took the lamp and turned it up and put on his coat and his boots and opened the back door. The water was on the 3rd step. He held the lamp out and looked at the yard, and the yard was gone. Not flooded the way a yard flooded in hard rain, with puddles connecting across the ground. Gone from the back step to the fence line to the barn. There was a surface of dark, moving water, shallow but continuous, spreading from the east where the river was and finding its way in every direction across the flat ground. He stepped off the porch into it. The water came to his ankle, cold through his boot. He waded to the barn. When he pushed the door open, he heard the horses before he saw them. The nervous movement of animals that had already understood something their owner was still in the process of understanding. The water on the barn floor was 4 inches deep, both horses in their stalls, moving, their eyes showing white at the rim. He went back to the house. He went upstairs and put his hand on Margaret's shoulder, and she was awake before he said a word. That was how she slept in hard winters, close to the surface. Available. "It is here," he said. She sat up. "Get the tin box," he said. "Get the blankets. The children." She was out of bed before he finished the sentence. He heard her moving in the room, her feet on the floor, the sounds of a woman who knew where every object in her house lived and could find it in the dark. She pulled the tin box from under the floorboard. She held it against her chest and went to Clara's room. He went to James first because James could help. The boy was already half awake when Daniel opened his door, as if some animal part of him had heard what his conscious mind had not yet registered. "Get dressed," Daniel said. "Everything on. Come down and help me." James swung his legs off the bed without a word. They carried what they could to the upper floor. Blankets, the lamp oil, the small sack of dried beans from the kitchen shelf, 2 jars of preserved fruit, the salt, a length of rope, Daniel's tools, the ones he had already moved to the high shelves in the barn weeks ago out of instinct, were out of reach now. He took the knife from his belt and put it in his coat pocket. He thought about the ledger. It was on the kitchen table, where Margaret always left it, closed, in its usual place. He went down to the kitchen. The water was coming under the back door now, a thin dark line spreading across the boards with the same quiet patience with which it had been spreading across everything else. He stood in the kitchen and looked at the ledger. He picked it up. He held it in both hands, and he looked toward the staircase, and he thought about what was in it. 9 years. Every number Margaret had written, every harvest recorded, every debt tracked to its resolution, the record of everything they had done here, and what it had cost and what it had been worth. Then James called from the top of the stairs. His voice was not panicked. It was the voice of a boy trying very hard not to be panicked. Which was worse? "Dad, the water is inside." Daniel looked at the ledger in his hands. He looked at the staircase. He looked at the kitchen, at the water spreading across the floor from the door, at the table legs already standing in it. He put the ledger back on the table. He went upstairs. He would think about that moment for a long time afterward. The weight of the book in his hands, the sound of James's voice, the water moving across the kitchen floor. He would not be able to say, later, that it had felt like a decision. It felt like the absence of time to make one. But he had put it down. He had left it there on the table in the water. And that was its own kind of answer. Margaret was at the top of the stairs with Clara wrapped in a blanket and the tin box held against her hip. She looked at his empty hands. She looked at his face. She did not say anything. They went up to the storage room above the second floor. From outside, carried on the rain and the wind, he heard something. Not the levee breaking. You did not hear the levee breaking from 12 miles away. What he heard was the consequence of it. The shift in the sound of the night, the way the water outside changed register, going from the sound of water spreading to the sound of water given permission, a low and continuous rushing that was not a river and not rain, but something that lived in the category between them. Clara was awake now, sitting on the floor of the storage room with her blanket around her shoulders, looking at her parents. "Is it bad?" she said. Margaret sat down beside her and put her arm around her. Daniel stood at the small window of the storage room and looked out at the dark water below, far to the south, moving across the surface. A small light, a lamp in a boat, moving steadily southward with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where they were going. He watched it cross the window's frame and disappear into the dark. He did not know who it was. He only knew that whoever was out there on the water in the dark of January 10th, 1862, they were not surprised by any of this. They were moving through it like a person moving through their own house. He stood at the window until the light was gone. Then he went to sit with his family on the floor of the storage room, above everything they had built, above everything they had left, and waited for the morning to show them what the night had done. He came from the east. On the afternoon of January 11th, his name was Thomas Briggs, and he drove mail and messages between Sacramento and the outlying farms. And he arrived at the Colton place in a flat-bottomed boat he had borrowed from a man on the edge of the city who had the foresight to own one. He tied the boat to the upper porch railing, which was now at water level, and called up to the window. Daniel came to the window of the storage room and looked down at him. Briggs was a lean man in his 40s, someone who had spent enough years moving between places that he carried the weathered look of a man for whom the outdoors was simply the medium through which life happened. He was soaked. He had been soaked, by the look of him, for approximately 2 days, and had moved past the stage of minding it. "You all alive up there?" he said. "All 4 of us," Daniel said. Briggs nodded. "I have news from the city, if you want it. Come up." He tied the boat and climbed through the window they opened for him, and sat on the floor of the storage room with his back against the wall. Clara watched him from across the room with the serious assessment she gave to strangers. James sat forward with his elbows on his knees. Margaret handed Briggs a cup of water, which was all they had that was fit to drink, and he thanked her and held it. "Tell me," Daniel said. Briggs told them. He had been in Sacramento on the morning of January 10th when the water came over the levee on the north side of the city. It did not come over all at once. It came over at the low point, then spread along the backside of the levee wall, finding every weak section, and within 4 hours the streets of Sacramento were under water. K Street was under to the tops of the first-floor windows. The stage depot on J Street had water to the top of its front door. The brick buildings on the commercial blocks were holding, their first floors lost, their second floors full of people who had gotten there in time. The wood frame buildings on the edges of town were in worse shape, some of them listing, some already beginning to come apart at their foundations. People were moving through the streets in boats. James looked up when he said this. He had been to Sacramento 3 times in his life. He knew K Street the way you knew a street you had walked on a handful of occasions, which was not deeply, but with the particular vividness of a child's memory. He could see the apothecary on the corner, the hardware store where his father bought nails. He tried to put water over all of it, water deep enough to row a boat through, and the image would not assemble. It was like being told the floor of a room you knew had become the ceiling. "The governor," Briggs said. "Stanford. His inauguration was that morning." "January 10th, Margaret said. "January 10th. He came to the ceremony by boat." Briggs paused, rode to his own swearing-in. California was 11 years old, and its governor was rowing through its capital city to take the oath of office. He looked at the window. The newspapermen thought it was something to write about. Stanford did not seem to think it was anything but what it was. The room was quiet. Daniel sat with that image for a moment. He was not a man who thought much about governors or ceremonies, but there was something in it that landed on him in a way he had not expected. The state was 11 years old. 11 years old, and its leader was rowing a boat through the streets of its capital to take the oath of office. There was something in that which said something about the distance between what they had all come here to build and what the land had to say about what they had imagined. What about the people who could not get to the upper floors? Margaret said. Briggs looked at her. Some of them got out. Some of them were helped out. He paused. Some of them were not found right away. Marysville, Daniel said. Una, Stockton, Unda. How far does it go? Briggs looked at the window. At the flat brown water outside, going in every direction. I rode north of the city 2 weeks ago. Before the roads went, he said, as far north as I could get, and I rode south, and what I saw in both directions was the same thing. He paused. It is not flooded farmland out there, Mr. Colton. It is a sea. James turned and looked at the window. He looked at the water outside, which had been the entire visible world from this room for 2 days, and he tried to extend it, not as the water around his house, but as a continuous surface going north and south for distances he could not calculate. A surface under which were roads and fence lines and other farmhouses and other barns and other fields, all of it submerged, all of it quiet, all of it waiting under the same flat brown water that was lapping at the window frame of the storage room where he was sitting. He looked east at the Sierra Nevada through the glass. The mountains were visible, just barely, through the gray sky and the rain. They were the same as they had always been, high and white and absolutely unchanged by any of what was happening below them. He had looked at those mountains his whole life, and they had always been there at the edge of his world, solid and permanent. And something about seeing them now, unchanged, while everything below them had become unrecognizable, made him feel something he did not have a name for. Briggs stayed the night. He slept on the floor of the storage room with the Colton family. Before they slept, Daniel asked him the question that had been sitting at the back of everything since he arrived. Is the water still rising? Briggs thought about it. The rain is still coming, he said, until the rain stops. I do not know how you answer that question any other way. Daniel nodded. Mr. Colton, Briggs said. He said it in a way that meant he wanted to say something he was not sure how to say. I have moved around this state a long time. I have seen what it can do in a hard season. He looked at the window. I have never seen this. That was the last thing anyone said before they slept. Margaret lay awake next to Clara, who was sleeping with the absolute confidence of a child in her mother's vicinity. She listened to the rain. She listened to the water below them, the quiet movement of it against the house, the soft bump of floating things against the walls. She was thinking about the ledger. She had seen Daniel's hands when he came up the stairs. Empty. She had known what that meant before he reached the top step. 9 years of numbers in that book. Not the money, which could be reconstructed from memory if she tried hard enough. The record of how they had spent those years, what they had decided, and what those decisions had cost, and what they had been worth. That was what was in it. That was what was gone. She lay next to her sleeping daughter in the dark, and she thought about this, and she decided, for now, to put it down the way you put down a tool you needed to pick up later. She could not do anything about it tonight. She could only be here, in this room, with these people, above the water. She closed her eyes. Outside, the rain continued. The water continued. The mountains stood at the eastern edge of the world and gave no indication of whether they were finished or just beginning. They were not finished, not even close. On the morning of the third day, Clara asked for breakfast, and there was almost nothing to give her. Margaret had taken inventory the night before, sitting with the lamp turned low so as not to waste oil, writing on the back of an envelope because the ledger was at the bottom of the kitchen and she had nothing else. What they had brought to the upper floor in those first hours, before the water came inside, before the decisions got made in the dark and the hurry one cloth sack of flour, partially wet along the bottom seam, a tin of salt, 4 apples from the cellar barrel that Daniel had grabbed without thinking, good instinct in a bad moment, 2 jars of preserved beans, a small piece of salt pork wrapped in cloth, enough coffee for perhaps 4 mornings if they were careful, lamp oil for 3 days, maybe 4 if they kept the wick low. She looked at the list. Then she looked at the window, at the water outside that had not moved in any direction that indicated it intended to leave. And she thought about the larder downstairs, which had 4 months of provisions in it. And she thought about the fact that the larder was currently underwater. She did not write any of that down. She folded the envelope and put it in her pocket. Breakfast was flour mixed with water and salt, cooked on the small iron stove in the corner of the storage room that they used in winter for heat, and that now served the additional purpose of being the only means of cooking they had. The result was something between a flatbread and a mistake, but it was hot, and it filled the stomach, and Daniel ate his without comment, which Margaret took as the highest available form of appreciation under the circumstances. Clara ate half of hers, and then held the rest and looked at it. "It does not taste like bread," she said. "It has some of the same ingredients." Margaret said. Clara considered this. "Which ones?" "Flour, sal. What is missing?" "Yeast, eggs. The time to do it properly." Clara thought about this with the thoroughness she brought to most problems. "Can we get those things?" "Not today." "What about tomorrow?" Margaret looked at the window. "We will see about tomorrow." Clara ate the rest of her bread. The water that day was the color of the Missouri River in spring. That same heavy brown that was not the color of the river itself, but of everything the river had picked up along the way. Through the window they watched it carry things. A wooden door, still on its hinges. A length of fence rail. A woman's hat, black, moving with a certain dignity south across the surface. A wash tub, once. In the early afternoon, an entire section of what appeared to be a roof, perhaps 20 feet of it, timbers and shingles intact, moving as a single slow piece through the water, like a raft that had forgotten its purpose. James sat at the window and counted. He had started on the first morning. He told Briggs. When the man asked what he was doing, he was keeping track of what was passing, building a picture in his mind of where it was all coming from, which direction the current was moving, what the shapes of the things floating told him about what had happened to them. Briggs sat down next to him, and they counted together for a while. 2 people doing the same thing, for slightly different reasons. James, because he needed something to do with the fear, and Briggs, because he had spent enough years moving through the world that he knew the value of watching. "That is a barn door," Briggs said. "I counted that," James said. "It was the 4th thing this morning. Where do you think it came from?" James looked at the current. "North," he said. "Everything is moving south. So it came from the north." How far north? James thought about it. fast as the water is moving. Could be miles. He paused. Could be Eli Marsh's place. Neither of them said anything after that. The tin box sat in the corner of the storage room where Margaret had placed it on the first night. On the second day she opened it and sat with the contents in her lap. $47. Her parents' photograph. The deed to the land. The silver ring. She held the ring for a moment, turning it between her fingers. Then she put everything back in the box and closed the lid. Daniel watched this from across the room without appearing to watch it. He knew what the ring meant, had always known, without it having been said. She wore the ring in Ohio and not here. Not because she was ashamed of it, but because this life required different hands than that life had. And the ring was a record of those other hands. He looked away before she could catch him watching. On the third day, after the flour bread and the question about yeast, Clara came to sit beside him at the window. She was wearing her coat over her nightgown. The coat buttoned wrong, one side higher than the other, a thing she had been doing since she was 4, and that he had long since stopped correcting. She sat next to him and looked at the water and was quiet for a while. Then she said, "Daddy, is our house going to be all right?" He looked at her. She was looking at the water, not at him, her face carrying the expression she wore when she was asking something she was not sure she wanted answered. "The house is still standing," he said. "I know, but is it going to be all right?" He looked at the water. He thought about what the floors would look like when the water went down, what the walls would look like, what the wood that had been dry for 9 years and was now submerged would look like when it finally came back to the air. "We will fix whatever needs fixing," he said. Clara thought about this. James said, "The chair from the parlor is probably in Sacramento by now." Daniel almost smiled. James might be right. Mama's rocking chair too. He had not told her about the rocking chair, about what he had seen that morning through the parlor doorway. The rocking chair that Margaret's grandmother had made in Cork and that had traveled to Ohio and then to California. The chair. That was the only piece of the old life that had made the whole journey. Sitting upright in the water, on the parlor floor, still on its rockers, moving gently back and forth in the current, as if someone were sitting in it. "Mama's rocking chair is downstairs," he said. "It will be fine." Clara leaned against his arm. Outside the window, the water moved south, carrying its inventory of other people's losses, unhurried and completely indifferent to what any of it had meant to the people who had owned it. A child's boot, a jar with a lid still screwed tight, a length of rope that moved in the current like something alive. All of it going south, all of it going away, all of it past caring where it ended up. Daniel put his arm around his daughter, and they sat at the window together and watched it go. The hardest part of the third night was not the food or the water or the cold that came through the window in the afternoons when the wind shifted north. It was the sounds from the floor below. During the day there was light and noise and things to do, and the sounds from below were covered by conversation and movement. But at night, when the lamp was low and the children were asleep, and he and Margaret lay in the dark, the sounds came up through the floor with perfect clarity. The water moving through the rooms, the bump and slide of furniture that had lifted off the floor and was drifting slowly from wall to wall, the particular sound of wood that had been dry for years absorbing water it was not built to absorb. And once, in the middle of the night, A heavy sliding sound from the direction of the kitchen that went on for several seconds and then stopped. He lay in the dark, trying to determine what it had been. Eventually, he concluded it was the stove. The iron stove that weighed 200 pounds, sliding 6 inches across the kitchen floor in the current. Margaret was awake when he heard it. He knew, because she did not ask what it was. She was listening to the same sounds he was, and she already had the same answer. He thought about the ledger. He thought about it the way you thought about a thing you had not done and could not undo. He had held it in his hands. He had stood in the kitchen with the water coming under the door and the ledger in his hands, and he had put it back on the table. He had made the only choice available to him in that moment. He knew that, but the knowing did not dissolve the other thing. The sharp and useless weight of having left behind something that could not be replaced. He did not say this to Margaret. She knew anyway. He would learn that about the flood. Later, when there was time to think about what it had taught him. The flood took things, but the things it took were not always the things you expected to mind the most. The smell came on the 4th day. The first 3 days the water had a smell that was familiar in the way that all water had a smell. The particular mineral cold of river water, the undertone of mud and wet grass, the smell of rain that had been falling for so long. It had become the smell of the air itself. That smell was not pleasant, but it was recognizable. It was the smell of weather. It had a category. The smell that came on the 4th day had no category. It came in through the window in the morning, and Clara was the first one to react. Setting down her cup and turning her head toward the window with an expression that was not quite distaste and not quite alarm, but somewhere between them. She did not say anything. She just put her cup down and breathed through her mouth, and after a while she moved to the other side of the room, as far from the window as the small space allowed. By midday there was no far side of the room. Daniel stood at the window and looked out at the water, and he could see now the sources of what he was smelling. His livestock, which had been in the barn when the water came. His neighbor's livestock too. Animals from properties upstream that had come down in the current and settled in the slow water around the house. He counted from the window 4 cattle, 2 of which he recognized as his own by their markings. A dozen sheep from somewhere north, chickens beyond counting, their feathers spread on the water like small pale flowers. He did not count the horses. He turned away from the window. Margaret had taken a piece of cloth and wetted it with the last of the clean water and given half to Clara, without explaining why. Clara held it in front of her nose and mouth and looked at her mother over the top of it with the wide eyes of a child who was old enough to understand that something was wrong and young enough to still believe that her mother's response to it was the authoritative one. "Will it go away?" Clara asked, her voice muffled by the cloth. "When the water goes down?" Margaret said. "When will the water go down?" Margaret looked at the window. "I do not know exactly, but it will." She said it the way she said things she believed but could not prove. James was at the window. He had stopped counting things. He was watching something to the south, something Daniel could not immediately locate when he came to stand beside him. "There," James said. "A boat. Small, flat-bottomed, moving north through the water with 2 people in it. Moving slowly, but with clear direction, coming from somewhere south." Daniel watched the boat. It was moving with the confidence of people who had somewhere to be and knew how to get there. As it came closer, he saw that there was one person in the boat. Not two. One person rowing, and something else in the bow. Something lying down. The rower was a woman. He could not see her face clearly, but he could see the way she moved. The economy of her strokes. The way she read the current and used it rather than fought it. The boat came within 50 yards of the house, and he saw her face. Rosa Velasquez. He knew her the way neighbors knew each other in an area where neighbors were spread wide. Which was to say, he knew who she was and where her land was, and that she was the widow of a California rancher whose family had held land in this valley since before California was a state. He had spoken to her perhaps 4 times in 9 years. She was 40 years old, or near it, with the look of a woman whose life had been conducted primarily outdoors. She was alone in the boat. The figure in the bow was an old woman, wrapped in blankets, lying still. Rosa looked up and saw Daniel in the window. She did not stop rowing, but she held his gaze for a moment with the level look of a person assessing a situation in real time. "How many?" she called up. "5, he said, counting Briggs. "We are all right for now." She looked at the window below his, the second-floor window, then back at him. "Water inside. Lower floor." She nodded. She looked at the old woman in the bow for a moment, checking something, and then back at Daniel. "I have clean water at the oak stand north of here," she said. "If you need it, come north. I will leave it where you can reach it from a boat." "We do not have a boat." She looked at the barn roof, which was above the water and visible from where she sat. "You have boards and barrels," she said. "If it comes to it." She started rowing again. Then she did something Daniel did not expect. She stopped. She held the oars still and she looked south, toward where the valley opened out behind her, toward the land that had been her family's, before it had been anyone else's. She looked at it for a long moment. The water covered it the same way it covered everything else, without preference, without memory, without any awareness of what it was submerging. Her face did not change. It was not grief. Exactly. It was the expression of someone making a record of something. The way you looked at a thing you needed to remember accurately because you were not certain you would see it again. Then she picked up the oars and rowed. Daniel stood at the window and watched her go. He watched the way she read the current, the way she sat in the boat, like a person who had been in boats her whole life and did not think about it any more than he thought about walking. When she was almost out of sight, he turned from the window and found Margaret standing behind him. She had been watching, too, from further back in the room. She knew where the old woman was. Margaret said, "She knows this land," Daniel said. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "We have been here 9 years, and I do not know any of this." He understood what she meant. It was not a criticism. It was an observation about the difference between owning land and knowing land, between arriving somewhere and understanding where you had arrived. Rosa Velasquez had not arrived here. Her family had been here long enough that knowing this land was not something they had to try to do. It was something they had simply done. The way you knew a house you had been born in. He thought about that for a while. Before dark, Rosa came back through going north. She was alone in the boat this time, moving faster without the weight of a passenger. She did not stop, but she raised one hand as she passed, and Daniel raised one back from the window. That night, the smell was worse. There was no way to address it that was adequate to it. They kept the window cracked for air, which helped with the closeness of 5 people in a small room but worsened the smell, and they tried it closed, which helped with the smell but made the air heavy by midnight. They settled on the window, cracked a hand width. A compromise that fully satisfied no one. Clara stopped eating at full portions. She ate what was put in front of her, but she ate it slowly and with the careful manner of someone trying to accomplish a task while ignoring the context. She did not complain. She was 8 years old, and she was trying very hard, and Daniel could see it. The small daily work of a child trying to be less trouble than she was afraid of being. He thought about how she had been born in this house, in the room directly below where they were sitting now. How California was the only world she knew. How the field outside, the one that was not a field anymore, was the field she had walked since she could walk. At some point, in the middle of the 4th night, Margaret put her hand on his arm, not to say anything, not to ask anything, just to put her hand there. The way you put your hand on something you needed to confirm was still present. He put his hand over hers. They lay like that in the dark and listened to the house below them doing what it had to do with the water inside it, and outside the water doing what it had to do with everything it covered. And further out the rain, continuing as it had continued for 6 weeks, without concern for what any of it meant to the people it was happening to. The smell, by morning, would be worse still. They were not through the worst of it yet, not even close. On the morning of January 10th, 1862, Leland Stanford became the 8th governor of California. He arrived at the ceremony by rowboat. This was not a detail the newspapers treated as remarkable, which was itself remarkable. The Sacramento Union ran the story on its front page with a description of the flooding and a brief account of the inauguration. And the tone of it was the tone of a paper that had decided to report what had happened, without entirely deciding how to feel about it. The governor had arrived by boat. The streets of the capital were underwater. The new state had sworn in its new leader, while the city sat in a river. This was the situation, and the paper reported it, and did not editorialize. Perhaps because there was nothing to say about it that the situation did not already say for itself. Stanford was 40 years old that January. He had come to California in the rush, made his money, not in the mines, but in the supply of the miners, which was the shrewder move, and the one that lasted. He was a large man, with the physical confidence of someone who had never seriously doubted his own judgment. And he had come to the governorship with a list of things he intended to accomplish and a general understanding of the problems the state faced. He had not put flooding on the list. When the boat carrying him moved through the streets of Sacramento that morning, he sat in the bow and looked at what there was to look at. On K Street, the water was at the top of the first-floor windows of the brick commercial buildings. The wooden signs that hung above the shop doors were underwater. He could see them down there, through the brown water. The painted letters still visible. Hardware, dry goods, surveyor, attorney at law. A wooden sign came loose from its bracket as they passed. It rose slowly to the surface and then moved south in the current, turning as it went. The lettering on it coming in and out of view. Groceries. He watched it until it moved around the corner of the block and out of sight. There was something in that image that said something about the nature of what they had all come here to build. All of them. The farmers and the merchants and the politicians and the dreamers. Something about the distance between what they had imagined and what the land had to say about what they had imagined. A grocery sign floating south through the capital city on a January morning. California was 11 years old. That fact sat beneath everything else that January. Beneath the inauguration and the flooding and the levee failures and the reports coming in from the valley, California was 11 years old, which meant its institutions were 11 years old, which meant that every system the state depended on to function in ordinary times was 11 years old. And when things stopped being ordinary, those systems revealed exactly how young they were. The levee network around Sacramento had been built in sections by different people over several years, with no central authority coordinating the design, no common standard for construction, no unified plan for what would happen if the river rose beyond what any individual section had been built to contain. A civil engineer who had reviewed the system 2 years before the flood had submitted a report recommending a comprehensive redesign under a single authority. The report had been read and discussed and filed. The redesign would have cost money the city had decided it did not have. The levee failed the way things failed when they had been built without a common standard, at the weakest section first, and then at the next weakest, and then all at once. The engineer was in the city that January. He did not say anything publicly about the report or the 3 years between the report and the flood. He moved through the streets in a borrowed boat, looking at what he was looking at. When people asked him what he thought, he said that the priority now was the people who needed help and that everything else could wait. He meant it, but he also meant something underneath it, which was that the flood was going to be the argument his report had not been able to make, and that some arguments were only made by the evidence of what happened when they were not heeded. In Sacramento, and in every flooded town along the valley, information had stopped moving. This was the part of the disaster that did not make the news in the way the flooding itself made the news, because you could not put a number to the absence of information. But it was real, and it shaped everything else. Messages sent before the flood had not arrived. Messages sent during the flood had not arrived. People were making decisions based on what they had known 2 weeks ago, or 3, or whenever the last reliable information had come through, and the situation had changed in ways that made that old information not just incomplete, but actively wrong. Families did not know where their members were. Businesses did not know the status of their goods or their debts. The state government did not have a current picture of what was happening in the valley because the means of getting that picture, the telegraph lines and the mail routes and the roads, were either underwater or cut off. Governor Stanford, in his inaugural address, spoke about the future of California with the confidence the moment seemed to require. He spoke about the railroad and the economy and the promise of the state. He spoke about what California could become. He did not speak about the flood in the terms it deserved, partly because he was giving an inaugural address and not a disaster assessment, and partly because nobody yet had the numbers. The numbers were still underwater. When they finally came in, months later, they would describe a state that had experienced, in 6 weeks, damage that would take years to repair. A state that had been functionally unable to govern itself. A state that had found out, in the worst possible way, that the confidence it had been building for 11 years was not the same thing as the infrastructure that confidence required. California was 11 years old, 11 years old, and alone in the flood, and doing what young things did when the situation exceeded what they had been built for, which was to find out, one failure at a time, where the limits were. What it learned would change how it built itself afterward. It would take time. The changes would come slowly. The way changes came in places where the argument had to be made by evidence rather than by foresight. But they would come. The sign that said groceries drifted south through the capital city and turned the corner and disappeared. The city would remember what that meant. For a while, William Brewer was a scientist, and he chose his words carefully. He was in California that winter as part of a state geological survey, moving through the valley in the weeks before the flooding, taking measurements and writing observations in the precise language of a man who understood that what he wrote would be read by people making decisions, and that the decisions required accuracy. On a morning in the middle of January, 1862, he stood on a small rise of ground east of Sacramento and looked at what was in front of him. He wrote in his journal that it looked like a sea. He chose the word sea over the word lake and over the word flood because sea was the word that matched what he was seeing. In every direction, the land had become water. The valley that stretched from the foothills to the coast ranges, which was among the most fertile agricultural land on the continent, was gone. In its place was a flat and featureless body of brown water that extended to every visible horizon, broken only by the distant dark line of the mountains to the east and the even more distant smear of the coast ranges to the west. He noted the roof lines of farmhouses showing above the water. He noted the tops of fence posts extending in lines across the surface, the only indication that this had once been organized land with organized purposes. He noted the absence of landmarks he had mapped 2 months before. He kept writing, because there was more to say, and he was a scientist, and his job was to say it. From where Daniel Colton's family sat in the storage room of their house 12 miles east of Sacramento, the world had contracted to what could be seen from 2 windows and heard through a floor. They had no way of knowing, in those days, the size of what they were in the middle of. They had Briggs's account of the city, and they had what they could see. And what they could see was water in every direction to the horizon. But the actual size of it was something else entirely. The flooding in the Sacramento Valley in the winter of 1861 to 62 extended, at its maximum, for roughly 250 miles from north to south. It covered an area of land that would have taken a man on a good horse 3 days to cross at its widest point. It submerged farms and towns and roads and mines and cattle ranges and river crossings and at least 4 county seats. It drowned hundreds of thousands of animals. It left tens of thousands of people on rooftops and upper floors and hillsides, waiting for water that had no particular schedule for leaving. One person standing on a rooftop in Stockton could look north and see nothing but water all the way to where Sacramento should have been. One person standing on a roof in Sacramento could look south and see nothing but water all the way to where Stockton should have been. They were at 2 ends of the same sea, and neither of them knew the other was there. James understood something about this on the 7th morning. He was at the window, the position he had been occupying for most of the previous week, and he was looking east at the Sierra Nevada. The mountains were visible that morning, clearer than they had been in days. He could see the high peaks and the white of the snow on them, and below the snow, the dark green of the timber, and below the timber, the foothills where the mining country was. He thought about the river. He thought about the fact that the American River started in those mountains and came down through the foothills and across the valley floor to the delta and then to the bay. He thought about what the mountains had been doing, what Briggs had described and what his father had told him about warm rain on snow. And he tried to trace the water from the mountains to the valley. He tried to see it as a connected thing rather than a collection of separate things. He had been in this valley his whole life. He had been born in this state. He had never thought about the valley as a shape, as a form with edges and a floor and a history of what happened to it when the conditions changed. He had thought of it the way you thought of the place you had always been, which was to say he had not thought of it at all. He thought about it now. He looked at the mountains, and he looked at the water between him and the mountains, and he tried to understand that the water was not an intrusion into the valley, but something the valley was capable of becoming. Something it became under certain conditions. Something it had been before and could be again. The valley was not the valley. The valley was sometimes this brown, flat sea with rooftops in it and the mountains at the edge and the rain still coming. He did not say any of this out loud. He was 14 and he was working it out and he was not ready to say it, which was all right. Some things needed to be worked out before they were said. Clara came to the window beside him. She stood at the window and looked out at the water, and after a while she said, "Where do you think the cat went?" James looked at her. "The marsh cat," she said. "They had an orange cat. I used to see it on the fence post when we went past." James thought about the marsh property, about what it looked like in normal times. The farmhouse and the barn, and the fence line with the post where the orange cat sat. He thought about what it looked like now, under the water. "I do not know," he said. Clara looked at the water for a while. Then she said, "I think cats know things." James did not say anything. "I think if the water was coming, the cat would have known," Clara said. "Before people knew," she paused. "I think it went somewhere high up." She said it with the certainty of a child who needed it to be true, and had decided that needing it to be true was close enough to having a reason. James looked at the water. "I think you are probably right," he said. That was the afternoon the roof came through. Not their roof, a section of someone else's roof. Moving south in the current, 30 feet of it, the timbers and shingles intact, the whole thing buoyant and deliberate and moving with the water as if it had somewhere to go. They all went to the window when Daniel spotted it. It was a good roof, solidly made, the kind that had been built to last, and it was traveling south across the inland sea without the house it had been built to cover. On the corner of the roof, near what had been the peak, a cat was sitting, orange, sitting on the high point of the moving roof with its feet tucked under its chest, looking straight ahead, moving with the roof, the way the roof was moving with the water, which was to say steadily and in one direction, and with no visible concern for what was happening around it. Clara made a sound. She pressed her hand against the glass and watched the cat, and the cat did not look at her. It looked south, looked at wherever it was going, and the roof carried it past the window and around the slow bend in the current and out of sight. Clara stood at the window for a long moment after it was gone. Then she turned around and sat down on the floor in the middle of the room, and James sat down next to her, and they sat together on the floor and did not say anything for a while, which was the right thing to do. And Daniel watched them from across the room and thought about all of the things his children were learning this winter that he had not known how to teach them, that you could not teach from the front of a room, that could only be learned from the inside of an experience that exceeded the categories you had come into it with. The water did not go down that day. It did not go down the next day either. But on the morning after that, standing at the window in the thin winter light, Daniel thought he saw something different in the way it lay against the house, something in the level of it, in where it sat against the foundation. That was not the same as it had been the morning before. He looked at it for a long time. He did not say anything to anyone. He had learned, over the past week, to be careful about hope, to hold it at a distance until it had proven it was real. False hope in a small room with 4 other people had a cost he was not willing to pay. But he looked at the water line against the house, and he thought that it was possible, just possible, that the sea had found its edge. He would know more tomorrow. Rosa Velasquez had been on the water for 6 days when she came back past the Colton place going north. She came through in the early morning, the light still thin and gray, her boat moving with the same economy it always moved with, the strokes even and unhurried. Daniel saw her from the window and opened it, and she looked up without stopping. "Still 5, she said. "Still 5, he said. The water might be dropping. She looked at the side of his house, at the water line on the boards. "Maybe," she said. "An inch, maybe less." She paused. "Do not trust it yet." She kept rowing. He watched her go north, and he thought about what 6 days on the water looked like from the inside. The work of it, the cold of it, the weight of what she must have seen. He had been in this room for 6 days with his family, and 4 walls and a roof and a small stove. She had been on the water. He did not yet fully understand what she had been doing out there. He would understand it better later, when the water went down and the accounts started coming in from the valley, when people began to find out what had happened in the places they could not see from their own windows. He would hear it from Briggs and from the newspaper and from neighbors who came back slowly to their properties in February and March, and from Rosa herself. One afternoon in the spring, standing at his fence line in the ordinary sunshine of a morning that had forgotten all about January, what she had been doing was this. She had known, before the water came, where the people were who would need help when it came. She had known because she knew the valley in a way that took generations to know. Not the valley as it appeared on a survey map or a land deed, but the valley as it lived, where the low ground was and where the high ground was, and which families had boats and which families had upper floors and which families had neither. Her family had known this valley since before the word California meant a state. Her grandfather had grazed cattle on this land when Sacramento was a trading post. Her father had watched the gold rush arrive and had understood, without being told, what the coming of that many people in that short a time meant for the land and for the people whose families had organized their lives around it. What it meant was what it had meant. Rosa had grown up watching her family's land reduce, not through any single dramatic event, but through the accumulation of legal mechanisms she did not fully understand and could not fully contest. Debts that required land as collateral, and creditors who understood the value of the collateral better than her father had. Taxes assessed on terms designed in Sacramento by men who had other purposes in mind. By the time she was 30, the rancho that had been her grandfather's was a fraction of what it had been, bordered on all sides by the farms of men who had arrived after the gold rush and bought cheap what had been made cheap by the same mechanisms. She did not hate these men. She lived alongside them the way you lived alongside the weather, accepting it as the condition of the life rather than its injustice, because she had found that accepting it was the only way to continue living it. She knew their names. She knew their properties. She knew, on a map she kept in her head rather than on paper, every piece of ground in the valley for 15 miles, in every direction, and what would happen to it when the river came over. When Briggs had come through in late December, spreading the word that the levees were at risk, Rosa had already moved her cattle to the high pasture 2 weeks before. She had already moved her household goods to the upper floor. She had already calculated which of her neighbors had upper floors and which did not, which had boats and which did not. The morning the water came, she was already on it. The first person she found was a man named Chen, who worked a kitchen garden on the south edge of the Hargrove property. He was 60 or so, a small man who had come to California in the rush and had stayed when the rush ended because there was nowhere to go back to that was easier than staying. He spoke little English and Rosa spoke no Cantonese, but the situation did not require language. He was standing on the roof of the small shed where he slept, the water to the eaves. And she pulled the boat alongside, and he got in, and she rowed him to the Hargrove farmhouse upper floor, where Mrs. Hargrove opened a window and took him in without a word. The second person was a child, a girl of perhaps 4, sitting on the top rail of a fence, the fence posts still above the water at that point, the water moving past below her at a depth that would have been over her head if she had fallen in. She was sitting on the rail with her arms wrapped around the post, and she was not crying. She had been afraid for long enough that the fear had become a kind of focused calm. Rosa brought the boat alongside and held out her hand, and the girl took it and got into the boat, as if she had been waiting specifically for this. Her family was on the roof of a house 200 yards north. She had gone out to feed the chickens when the water came and had not been able to get back. She had climbed the fence and held on for 4 hours. She fell asleep in the boat before Rosa reached the house. The third thing Rosa found was not a person. It was the remains of a labor camp on the south side of the Harrison property, which Harrison used for seasonal workers, primarily Chinese men who came up from Sacramento in the planting and harvest seasons, and lived in a row of low wooden structures that Harrison had built close to the ground, because the ground was level there, and level ground was easier to build on than sloped ground. The structures were underwater. The men who had been in them were not there. She did not find them for 2 more days. They were on the roof of the main Harrison barn, 14 of them, having made their way there in the first hours of the flooding, when the water came into the low structures faster than anyone had expected. Harrison himself had left for Sacramento by horse the day before the water came, taking his family and his strongbox and his important papers. He had told the men in the camp that the flooding was not expected to be severe and that they should stay at their posts. He had believed this when he said it. He had received a report from a Sacramento newspaper that said the levees were holding and that the flooding was expected to be minimal. The report was already out of date when he read it. The men on the roof had been there for 2 days when Rosa found them. No food. One jug of water. Half empty when the flooding started, and empty now. They had kept themselves warm by staying close together. Which was what you did when there was nothing else to do. Rosa looked at 14 men on a barn roof and looked at her boat, which held 4 people comfortably, and 6 if everyone accepted discomfort as the price of getting somewhere. She made 3 trips. On the 3rd trip, the water was high enough that she was rowing through what had been the upper branches of the orchard trees along the Harrison property line, the branches moving in the current below the surface, and she rowed through them carefully, feeling the oars catch and release against wood she could not see. The last 2 men got into the boat, and she rowed them to the Prentice place, which sat on a slight rise and had become, in the days since the flooding started, an informal gathering point for people Rosa had brought there, and people who had made their own way. One of the 14 men said something to her in Cantonese when he got out of the boat. She did not understand the words, but she understood what they were. She nodded. He nodded back. She pushed off from the wall and turned the boat south. She had 3 more places to check before dark. The Nissinon family she had been watching for was on the hill she had known they would be. Their camp was on the eastern edge of the valley, where the ground began its long slope up toward the foothills. And the family had been there, in various configurations, for longer than anyone she had spoken to could say with certainty. An old man and his wife, and their daughter, and her 2 children, living in a structure that was low to the ground in summer, and that the old man had apparently known well before the water came to leave. She saw them on the hill when she was coming back north on the 3rd day. 5 figures on the high ground above the waterline, the old man standing and the others sitting, and all of them watching the water with the patience of people who had seen rivers do things before and understood that rivers did what rivers did. She raised her hand. The old man raised his. She did not row to them, because they were above the water and did not need her boat. But she looked at them for a moment from the water below the hill, and she thought about the old man standing there, watching the valley flood, and what he knew about this land that she did not, and what his father had known, and his father's father, back past the point where the knowledge became indistinguishable from the land itself. Her grandfather had told her stories of floods in this valley before the Americans came, stories of years when the river took back the land it had made with its own sediment over the slow centuries. Her grandfather had told her these stories the way you told children stories that were also instructions, embedded with information about what to do and where to go and what the signs were. She had moved her cattle to high pasture 2 weeks before the levee failed. She looked at the old man on the hill, and she thought that they had both received the same instruction through different means. Neither of them had needed a newspaper report to tell them what was coming. They did not know, because they were mystical. They knew because their families had watched this river longer than anyone else who was here. She turned the boat south. There was a woman she had heard about, an older woman who lived alone near the river on the far south end, a woman named Hayes. No boat, could not swim. Rosa had heard about her from the Prentice family, mentioned in passing, the kind of detail that might not matter. It was the detail that mattered most. She found the woman on the afternoon of the 5th day. She was inside the house, the water to the eaves of the 1st floor. Rosa pulled the boat up to the 2nd floor window, which was above the water by perhaps 6 inches, and looked in. The woman was standing in the room. Standing. not sitting. The water inside was at her waist. She was standing in water to her waist in her own bedroom, holding the bedpost with both hands, and she looked at Rosa with the expression of a person who had been waiting for something without knowing what it would look like, and was now looking at it. Her name was Edna Hayes. She was 63 years old. She had been standing in that water for the better part of 2 days. The window was too high for her to reach from the inside. She had screamed the first day until she understood that screaming was not producing results, and then she had stopped and held the bedpost and waited. Rosa got her into the boat. It was not simple. The woman's legs had stopped working properly after 2 days in cold water, and Rosa had to get partly into the water herself to lift her over the window ledge. And by the time they were both in the boat, they were both wet to the chest, and the afternoon was going gray and cold. Rosa rowed. Edna Hayes sat in the bow wrapped in the blanket. Rosa kept in the boat and did not say anything for a long time. Rosa rowed. The water moved around them. The light dropped. After a while, the old woman said, "How did you know I was there?" "The Prentice family mentioned you," Rosa said. The old woman was quiet. "Nobody else came," she said. It was not an accusation. It was an observation, delivered in the flat tone of someone who had spent 2 days arriving at the conclusion the statement contained. Nobody else knew where to look, Rosa said. The old woman looked at the water around the boat. "And you did. I know this valley," Rosa said. Edna Hayes looked at her for a moment. Then she looked away, at the water, at the flat brown expanse of it going in every direction. "I have lived here 20 years, she said. "I do not know it at all." Rosa did not say anything to that. There was nothing to say that was both true and kind. And she had found, over the past 6 days, that the situation required kindness more than it required truth. She rowed. The water did not care what anyone knew about it. The water moved where it moved and stayed where it stayed, and the knowing of it or the not knowing of it made no difference to the water. It made all the difference to the people in it. Eli Marsh left on a Tuesday. He did not announce it. He did not come to the Colton place to say goodbye, partly because saying goodbye would have required a boat he did not have, and a trip across water he preferred not to make, and partly because Eli Marsh was not a man who had ever been comfortable with the ceremony of departure. He had left Ohio in '49 without much in the way of ceremony, and he had arrived in California and stayed without much in the way of reflection, and he left the same way he had done everything else in his life, which was practically and without excessive sentiment. Daniel found out from Briggs in the 3rd week of January. Briggs had seen the Marsh place from the water, and had noted that the upper windows were dark, and had rowed close enough to call and gotten no answer. Later, he had run into a man at the Prentice gathering point, who had seen Eli and his son moving east along the high ground 2 days before, carrying what they could carry, heading toward the road that went up into the foothills, and then eventually down to the valley on the other side. Going east meant going toward the mountain. Going toward the mountains meant going toward the mining country. Going toward the mining country, in January of 1862, meant going toward something that no longer existed in the form it had existed in before the rains. Eli's son Robert had been working a claim near Placerville for 3 years. Not a rich claim, a working claim, the kind that produced enough to make the work feel justified, and not enough to make it feel triumphant. Robert was 26 years old, and he had been in the mountains since he was 23, and he had the particular stubbornness that young men developed in the mining country. A stubbornness that was not quite confidence and not quite delusion, but lived in the neighborhood of both. Eli had been trying to get word to him since the rains started. He had sent a letter in December. He had sent a second in early January. Neither had gotten through because the mail was not going into the mountains during what was shaping up to be the worst mountain winter in recent memory. When the water came to his lower floor on the night of January 10th, Eli Marsh had stood in his kitchen and looked at the things he had accumulated in 30 years on California land, and he had made a list in his head of what could be moved upstairs and what could not. The list of what could not was longer. He moved what he could and went upstairs and waited. He waited 4 days. On the 4th day, he decided that waiting was the wrong response for a man who had a son somewhere in the mountains, with no way to receive information about whether his father was alive. He built a raft from boards and barrels and rope, not a good raft, but a floating one, and poled it to the high ground east of his property and then walked. They walked east for 2 days. The road into the foothills was passable only in the sense that it was above the water. The mud was a foot deep in the low sections. The bridges over the smaller creeks were gone, and the creeks themselves were running white and wide, and they crossed them on logs that Eli cut and placed himself, one at a time. Slow work in the rain. On the 2nd day, they reached the edge of the mining country. What they found was a version of what the valley below had experienced, but condensed and vertical rather than wide and flat. The water that had run off the mountains in those weeks had channeled through ravines and gullies and canyons, concentrating its force in the narrow places and releasing it all at once. The flumes that the miners had built to channel water for the washing operations, structures of wood and iron that had taken years to construct, were gone, not damaged, gone, or in pieces, or relocated to positions that had nothing to do with their original purpose. The roads into the individual claims were rivers. The camp at the bottom of the canyon below Placerville was a lake. Eli found his son on a hillside above the camp, sitting with 7 other men from the surrounding claims, watching from above. They were all alive. They had gotten to the hillside in time, and they had been there for 4 days, watching the water do what it was doing to what they had built. Eli sat down next to Robert. They looked at the camp. The water was over the roof lines of the lower structures. The flume that Robert had spent most of the previous summer helping to build was gone. The mountings visible at the upstream end, and then nothing. The sluice boxes were gone. The tools, the picks and the iron pans and the long toms, were wherever the water had taken them. Robert had a beard now that he had not had in the spring. Eli looked at his son's face, and he thought about the stubbornness he had observed in Robert before the rain started. The quality that had made him stay in the mountains for 3 years on a claim that produced enough to justify staying. He looked at his son's face now, and he thought that the stubbornness was still there, but it was wearing a different expression. "How bad?" Eli said. Robert looked at the water. "Everything below is gone," he said. "The flume, the sluice, the cabin." He paused. 3 years of work. Eli looked at the water too. "The claim," he said. "The claim is still there," Robert said. "The gold is still there, wherever it is. But to get at it, we need the flume. And to build the flume, we need money. And to have money, we need to have worked the claim. And to work the claim, we need the flume. He stopped. You see the problem. Eli saw the problem. He had seen the shape of it before. Not this exact problem, but the circular logic of a situation where the thing you needed to get the thing was the thing you were trying to get. He had seen it in Ohio before he came west, had seen it in the early years in California, had seen it in various forms throughout a life that had required regular renegotiation with circumstances. He looked at the flooded camp below them. He thought about the flood in the valley, about his lower floor, about the things he had moved upstairs and the things he had not been able to move, and the things that were now wherever the current had taken them. He thought about the 30 years he had spent on his property, every season of it, every repair and every harvest, and every morning of walking out to the fence line and knowing exactly where he was. "How much do you have?" he said. Robert was quiet for a moment. "Enough to get home," he said. "If home is a place I am going." Eli looked at him. "Ohio?" Robert said. "I have enough to get to Ohio." He paused. "Or I have enough to stay here and start over." "But not both." The other men on the hillside were having their own versions of this conversation. Or not having it. Sitting in the silence of men who were doing arithmetic that had no good answers. One of them, a man named Pollock, who had been in the mountains since '53, stood up after a while and said he was going back down to see what was left of his equipment. 3 others went with him. The water was dropping. Robert watched them go. "You could stay," Eli said. "Rebuild." "I know," Robert said. "Or you could go." "I know." They sat on the hillside and looked at the water. Eli thought about the thing he had come to California to find in '49, which was not exactly gold, or not only gold, but some version of a life that was not the life he would have had if he had stayed in Ohio. He thought about whether it had produced that version. He thought about 30 years on the land, about the east fence line that Daniel Colton's boy had been repairing on an ordinary November afternoon, about the orange cat on the post. He had not seen the cat since the water came. He told himself the cat had gotten somewhere high and dry. He had been telling himself this for 2 weeks, without any evidence either way. "I will tell you what I think," Eli said. Robert looked at him. "I think the land in the valley is still good land," Eli said. "I think when the water goes down, it will still be good land. Better. Maybe. All that river mud on it." He paused. "But I am 55 years old, and I have a lower floor full of whatever the river left in it, and a barn I do not know the condition of, and a field I cannot assess until the water drops." He looked at his hands. "I do not know that I have another start in me." Robert was quiet. "That does not mean you do not," Eli said. They sat on the hillside until the light started going gray, and then they went back to the camp to find a dry place to sleep. 3 weeks later, Eli Marsh locked the door of his house in the Sacramento Valley and walked away from it. He locked it out of habit, the habit of a man who had locked doors behind him his whole life, moving from one place to the next, carrying what he could carry, and leaving the rest for whoever came after. He and Robert got on a ship in San Francisco in February, and sailed to Panama, and crossed the Isthmus, and sailed north to New York, and took a train to Ohio. Ohio was cold and flat and familiar, and entirely uninterested in what either of them had experienced in California. Eli stood on a street in Columbus in March of 1862 and looked at the buildings and the people and the ordinary activity of a city that had not flooded. And he thought about the Sacramento Valley underwater, about the rooftops showing above the surface, about the east fence line in November, and he thought I had 30 years of it. He thought it the way you thought about something that was over. He thought it the way you thought about something that was also, whether you wanted it to be or not, the best version of the life you had lived. He went inside out of the cold. Back in the Sacramento Valley, Daniel Colton was still in the storage room above his flooded house, watching the water line and waiting. He was not going anywhere. The water dropped 2 inches on the first day. Daniel measured it with a stick he pushed into the mud at the base of the house each morning, marking the level with a notch, the way you mark the growth of a child on a doorframe. 2 inches on the first day, 1.5 on the second, 3/4 on the third. When the rain came back for 2 days and erased the progress almost entirely. Then the rain stopped again and the dropping resumed, and after 11 days of this, the kind of progress that gave and then took back and then gave again, a little less than it had taken. The water was below the top of the ground floor windows, and Daniel could see the yard. What he saw was not the yard he had left. The mud began at the window glass and went in every direction without interruption. Not the thin film of mud that remained after a puddle dried, mud of substance and depth, the kind deposited by moving water over many days, carrying the sediment of everything the river had traveled through in the mountains and the foothills and across the valley floor. The fence posts were in it to half their height. The chicken coop was in it to its eaves. The path from the back door to the barn, a path Daniel had walked 10,000 times in 9 years, was indistinguishable from everything around it. He went down the stairs on the 12th morning. He went slowly, one hand on the wall, because he did not know what the stairs would hold. They held. The wood had absorbed what it had absorbed, and the stairs were soft in the way of wood that had been wet too long, but they held his weight, and he reached the bottom and stood in the kitchen. The mud on the kitchen floor was the height of his boot sole. It was not liquid. It had dried, all begun to dry, into something with consistency, a paste that yielded under his boot and then closed over the print as he lifted his foot, slow and deliberate, like something alive and patient. The kitchen table was where it had been. The legs sunk into the mud, one chair tipped against it, and one chair gone entirely. The stove had moved 6 inches from the wall. The curtains that Margaret had made the first winter were still on the window, mud-brown and stiff, hanging like something that had forgotten its purpose. He stood in the kitchen for a moment. He looked at the table. At the place where the ledger had been, there was mud in that corner now, and a shape in the mud that might have been the ledger and might have been something else. A folded cloth, a piece of board that had drifted in and settled there. He did not go to it. He looked at it from across the room, and then he looked away and went back upstairs. Margaret was waiting at the top. "What is down there?" she said. "Mud," he said. "Everything is there. Most of it." "The stove?" "Still there. Moved some?" She looked at him the way she looked at him when she was determining whether the information she was receiving was complete. "The rocking chair," she said. He had seen it through the parlor doorway. Still there, on its rockers, exactly where it had always been. as if the flood had arranged itself carefully around it. The wood was dark with water, and the cushion was gone. Somewhere in the valley with the other things the current had decided to take. But the chair was there. "It is there," he said. Something in Margaret's face changed, small and quick. And then it was gone, and she was practical again. "Clara needs to stay up here today," she said. "She was warm again this morning." "I know. I will come down and start on the kitchen. Give me an hour first." She gave him the hour. He went down and walked through every room on the lower floor, and looked at each one the way you looked at something you needed to assess before you could feel anything about it. The kitchen, the parlor, the small room off the parlor that had been his office, where the farm records lived, or had lived. The front hallway. He walked through all of it, his boots making the slow sucking sound of boots in mud. And he made a list in his head of what was there and what was not, and what was there but damaged beyond use, and what might be salvaged. The list of what might be salvaged was not as short as he had feared. The list of what was damaged beyond use was not as long as he had feared. These two facts existed alongside the third fact, which was that salvaging what could be salvaged, and replacing what could not, and cleaning and repairing what needed repairing was going to take a very long time, and they did not have the resources they had had in November. And some of what they had lost could not be restored by any amount of time or money or effort. He stood in the parlor with the rocking chair, and he put his hand on the back of it, and he stood there for a moment. Then he went back upstairs and told Margaret it was time. They went down together. James came behind them, and Clara, who was not supposed to come down, came anyway, appearing at the top of the stairs when they were halfway down, with her coat buttoned wrong and her face still carrying the color that was not quite fever and not quite not. "Clara," Margaret said. "I want to help," Clara said. Margaret looked at her. Then she looked at Daniel. "She can sit in the kitchen," he said. Clara came down. She sat on the one remaining chair, and she watched them work, and she did not say anything for a long time. She sat with her hands in her lap, and she looked at the mud on the floor and the mud on the walls and the place where the curtains hung stiff and brown and wrong, and she was very quiet. After a while she said, "It does not look like our kitchen." "It will," Margaret said. She was moving mud with a flatboard, pushing it toward the door, the work requiring her full attention and her full strength. "How long?" Clara said. "A while," Margaret said. "Days." Margaret paused in her work. She looked at the kitchen, at the scope of what they were engaged in, at the walls and the floor and the stove, standing 6 inches from where it was supposed to be. "Longer than days," she said. Clara sat with this. The mud work was the hardest physical labor Daniel had done since the early years on the land, when he had been breaking ground that had never been broken, and the work was the kind that showed you what you were made of. Moving mud was not like moving dirt or moving water. It was heavier than water and less cooperative than dirt, and it had a way of coming back into the space you had just cleared, seeping in from the edges and the cracks, reminding you that it had been here before you and was in no hurry. He moved mud for 4 hours on the first day. At the end of 4 hours, the kitchen floor was not clean. It was less muddy than it had been, in the way that things were less than what they had been when that was the only direction available. He stood in the doorway and looked at what 4 hours had produced, and he thought about how many more hours were ahead of them, and he did not calculate it further, because calculating it further was not useful. James had been in the barn. He came back in the early afternoon with mud to his thighs and sat on the back step and pulled his boots off without being asked, and came in his socks and stood in the kitchen doorway. "The barn floor is bad," he said, "but the structure is sound. The loft held everything we put up there." Daniel nodded. "The seed stock is dry," James said. "The wheat in the upper bags is dry." Something shifted in the room when he said this. Not a large shift, just the particular quality of air in a room when the news has changed from the category of losses to the category of things that remained. "The lower bags," Daniel said. "Vet," James said. "I do not know if the grain is any good. We will find out when it dries." James nodded. He stood in the doorway looking at the kitchen, and Daniel looked at his son. At the 14-year-old face of him, at the way the past 2 weeks had arranged themselves on it. The seed was dry. That evening, when the children were in bed and the lamp was low, Margaret got the envelope from her pocket. She looked at it for a while. Then she put it on the table between herself and Daniel. He looked at it. "I need to know what we have," she said. "I know. The real number, not the number we had in November." She smoothed the envelope with her thumb. "The number we have now." He told her what he knew. The seed in the loft, the tools on the high shelves, most of them salvageable, the 2 remaining cattle, alive on the high ground, the money in the tin box, untouched, the debt to the Sacramento bank, unchanged by the flood, in the sense that debt did not care about the circumstances of the debtor. She listened. She did not write anything down, because the envelope was already full. "How long?" she said when he was done. "To what?" "To where we were in November." He thought about it honestly. 3 years, he said. "If the prices hold, if the seasons are normal, if nothing else goes wrong." She looked at the envelope. "And if something else goes wrong?" He did not answer that. They both knew what the answer was. She folded the envelope. "We need flour," she said, "and coffee, and something for Clara's fever. I will go to Sacramento when the road is passable." "When will that be?" "Another week, maybe 2. She nodded. She put the envelope back in her pocket. She blew out the lamp. In the dark, they sat for a moment at the table in the kitchen that did not yet smell like their kitchen, that smelled like the river and the mud and the long weeks of the flood. It would take a long time for it to smell right again. Smells were the last thing to come back after something like this. He had not known that before. He knew it now. Clara's cough came through the ceiling. 2 short coughs, and then silence. Margaret's chair pushed back. "I have got her," he said. He went upstairs and stood in the doorway of Clara's room and listened until her breathing evened out again, and the room was quiet. He stood there in the dark doorway for a while after that, listening to his daughter breathe, listening to the house settle around him. The sounds of a house that had been through something and was finding its way back toward its ordinary sounds. It did not sound yet like the house it was supposed to be, but it was still standing. That was enough for tonight. In February, the valley began to show itself again. It came back slowly and all wrong, the way things came back after being covered for a long time. The fence posts appeared first. then the tops of the low structures, then the ground itself, still dark with water, and soft enough that a boot sank 4 inches with each step. The road to Sacramento became passable in the 3rd week of February. Passable, meaning a wagon could make it if the driver was patient with the places where the road had become indistinguishable from the field beside it. Daniel went to Sacramento on a Thursday. He went for flour and coffee and the medicine Margaret had described, a preparation for the kind of persistent low fever Clara had been carrying for 3 weeks. He went alone because the wagon needed to be light, and because Margaret needed to be at the house, and because James was doing the work of 2 men in the barn and on the land and could not be spared. He drove in from the East Road and he did not recognize it. Not immediately. For a moment, coming over the slight rise where the road crested before the city began, he thought he had made a wrong turn somewhere. The buildings were where they were supposed to be, and the streets ran in the directions they were supposed to run. But the city was the color of the mud. Everything below the 1st floor window level was the color of river sediment dried onto brick and wood and stone. Water lines marked every building at the height the flood had reached. A line as clear as a pencil mark, running at a consistent height around the entire city. Below the line, mud. Above the line, the ordinary colors of buildings. Sacramento was 2 cities stacked on top of each other. The flooded city below and the regular city above. The border between them marked by a line you could see from the wagon seat as you came in from the East Road. He bought what he had come for. He stood at the counter of the apothecary on J Street, which had been underwater to its ceiling 6 weeks before, and he looked at the water line on the apothecary wall, while the man behind the counter filled his order with the same careful movements he had always used, as if the water line on his wall were a thing he had decided not to discuss. "How did you manage?" Daniel said. The man looked at him. "I went upstairs," he said. He put the medicine on the counter, and then I came back down. He named the price. Daniel paid it. He walked back to the wagon through the mud-brown streets. On K Street he stopped. He stood in the street, and he looked at the buildings on both sides, and he thought about the city that had been here before January, and the city that was here now, and the relationship between them. The buildings were the same buildings. The streets ran in the same directions. The people moving through them were the same people, going about the same business. But the water line on everything said that this was also a different place than it had been. A place that had been through something and was carrying the mark of it. The city had a number now. It had come out in pieces over the past weeks. Through the newspaper accounts and the reports filtering in from across the state, what California had lost in those 6 weeks was staggering by any measure. Cattle across the state, estimates ran to 200,000 head, dead or missing. Sheep into the millions. The economic losses to Sacramento alone would take years to calculate fully. The state itself was approaching insolvency. The bonds it had issued to cover wartime expenses, now competing with the cost of a disaster that had arrived without warning and departed without apology. And those were only the numbers that could be counted. The things that could not be counted were something else. The letters that had never arrived, the plans that had been made before January and were now unmakeable. The farmers who had gone to Sacramento for supplies in December and had not been able to get back to their families for 3 weeks. The families who had not heard from someone and did not know yet whether the not hearing was a matter of roads or something worse. He drove home that evening, after the children were in bed, He sat at the kitchen table, and he told Margaret what he had seen in the city. She listened the way she listened to everything, completely, with the particular quality of attention she brought to information she knew she would need to use. When he was done, she opened the tin box. She put it on the table between them and took out the contents one at a time. The money, the deed, the photograph of her parents, the ring. She put each thing on the table and she looked at it. $31, she said. She had spent some in February on the flour and coffee and medicine. The deed is still good. She held it. The land is still ours. Yes. She put the deed down. She picked up the photograph. Her parents had died in Ohio before she came to California. She had never shown Daniel this photograph in 16 years of marriage. He had known it was in the box because he knew everything in the box. But she had never shown it to him, and he had never asked. She looked at it for a moment. Then she put it on the table and pushed it toward him. He picked it up. A man and a woman standing in front of a painted backdrop, the way people stood in photographs. Her father had the same quality around the eyes that Margaret had, the same way of looking at a thing that suggested the looking had a purpose. He looked at the photograph for a moment, and then he put it back on the table between them. She picked up the ring. She held it in both hands, turning it, the silver catching what lamplight there was. I have not been able to wear this in 6 years, she said. My hands changed. I know, he said. She looked up at him. You knew. I noticed. She looked at the ring. It was my mother's, she said. She wore it every day until she could not. Then she gave it to me. She turned it in her hands. I thought California would be a few years. Come out. See what it was. Go back to Ohio. I did not think I was coming to stay. Did you want to go back? She thought about it honestly. For the first 2 years, she said. Then I stopped wanting to go back and started just living here. And then I stopped thinking about the difference. She put the ring on the table. She looked at everything on the table. $31. A deed to 80 acres of mud. A photograph. A ring that no longer fit. Tell me the real number, she said. Not what we had. What we have. He told her. The seed in the loft, which was their planting capital. The thing that would allow them to put a crop in the ground in spring, if the ground dried in time, and if they had the equipment to work it. The 2 cattle, the tools, the barn, structurally sound, the house, damaged but standing. The $31, which had to cover everything between now and the first income from any crop they managed to get in the ground. She listened to all of it. Then she was quiet for a while. 3 years, she said. You said 3 years to where we were. If things go well, things do not always go well. No, he said. She put the contents back in the tin box. 1 piece at a time. The money, the deed, the photograph, the ring. She closed the lid. Clara's fever was lower this morning, she said. I noticed. The medicine helped. Seems like. She put the box on the floor. She folded her hands on the table. We planted in April before, she said. The year we broke the north field. The ground was wet then too. He remembered that year. The mud on the boots. The way the plow had dragged through ground that was not quite ready. Ground was wet, he said, but not like this. No, she said, not like this. She looked at her hands. But we planted. He looked at his wife. across the kitchen table. He thought about what it cost to keep believing in something after 9 years and a winter like this one. He thought she deserved better than what he was able to offer her right now. He also thought that what he was able to offer her right now was the truth, and that she had always preferred the truth to anything he might substitute for it, and that preferring the truth was one of the things he had loved about her for 16 years and continued to love. "We will plant in April," he said. She nodded once. The lamp was low between them, and outside the February night was cold and clear, and the stars were out over the valley, over the mud, and the recovering land, and the river back in its banks, and all the long work of a spring that was coming, whether they were ready for it or not. They sat at the table in the low lamplight for a while. Then Margaret reached over and turned down the lamp, and they sat in the near dark for a moment, and then they went to bed. Tomorrow the mud work would continue, but April was coming. Margaret went to Sacramento in June. She went for young chickens from a poultry breeder north of the city, which she had arranged by letter 2 weeks before. She went for a new ledger, which she had been making do without since January, by writing on the backs of envelopes and the margins of a seed catalog, and on one occasion the inside cover of the family Bible, which Daniel had not commented on. She went for nails, for a length of iron pipe the barn needed, for salt, for a list of 12 other things she had been accumulating since February, with the discipline of a woman who had learned that 12 trips to Sacramento cost more than one. James went with her. He was 14, going on something older, the winter having moved something forward in him that usually moved forward more gradually. He sat on the wagon seat beside his mother, and he was quiet in the particular way he had been quiet since January. The way of someone who had seen something and was still in the process of deciding what it meant. They came over the rise east of the city, and Margaret pulled the reins back and the horse slowed. Something was different. She could see it from the rise, though she could not immediately say what she was seeing. The city looked like itself from a distance, the same skyline of brick buildings and wooden structures, and the river glinting to the west. But there was something happening in the streets that she could not make out at this distance. Something that involved a great deal of earth being moved, dust rising in the still June air from the center of the city. She drove in. On K Street, she understood. The street was being raised, not repaired, not resurfaced. Raised. There were men with wheelbarrows and men with shovels and men directing other men, and they were filling K Street from the sides inward, bringing earth in wagons from somewhere outside the city and packing it against the building fronts and filling the space between the building fronts until the level of the street itself was rising, inch by inch, foot by foot, being brought up to a new height that would put it above where the January water had been. Margaret stopped the wagon and looked at it. The building she was stopped in front of was a dry goods store she had been coming to for 7 years. The front of the building looked as it had always looked, brick facade and painted sign and 2 windows flanking the door. But the door was now 4 feet above the level of the old street, accessible by a set of wooden steps that had been built to reach it from the current working surface, which was itself 2 feet above the original street level and still rising. A man came out of the dry goods store and down the wooden steps and past the wagon without looking at her, the way men move through a city that was being rebuilt, purposefully and with no time for anything not connected to the purpose. She looked at the water line on the building. It was still there. The tide mark of January, running at its consistent height across the brick. The new street level was below it. The finished street level, when the fill was complete, would be above it. When the work was done, the water line would be underground, buried under the new street. And anyone who came to Sacramento in 10 years and walked down K Street would walk above it without knowing it was there. James was looking at the building fronts on the other side of the street. The first floors, he said. She looked. The buildings on the other side had their first floors partially below the new street grade. The tops of the first floor windows were visible at the level where the working surface currently sat. When the fill was complete, when the street was raised to its intended height, those first floor windows would be below street level. The first floors of those buildings would be underground. They are burying the bottoms of the buildings. James said. Yes, she said. The people who live there, they will have to go in from the second floor, she said. Or they will use the lower floors for storage. She paused. Or they will dig out a new entrance below the street. James looked at the buildings, at the street being raised around them, while the buildings stood still and let themselves be buried to their lower floors. Why not just move? He said. Build on higher ground. She thought about it. Because this is where they built, she said. Because the streets are here, and the commerce is here, and the people are here. She watched a man with a wheelbarrow tip a load of earth onto the growing surface. Because leaving means everything you put here was for nothing, and they do not want it to be for nothing. James was quiet. So they raise it, he said. They raise it, she said. She drove the wagon forward slowly. Through the work, past the men and the wheelbarrows and the accumulating earth, past the buildings with their water lines and their wooden steps and their first floors, descending below the new surface. She drove through it, all the way to the north end of K Street, and then east toward the poultry breeder. And she thought about what she had just seen, and she turned it over the way she turned over most things, looking at it from the side, from underneath, from the angle that told you something the straight-on view did not. She bought the chickens. She bought the ledger. She bought the nails and the iron pipe and the salt and the other items on her list. She conducted the business of the day with the efficiency of a woman who had been conducting the business of days under various conditions for 40 years and knew how to keep the purpose of a thing from being lost in the difficulty of it. In the afternoon, on the way back through, she stopped the wagon on K Street again. The work had continued through the day. The street was perceptibly higher than it had been in the morning. The progress visible in the way the steps to the dry goods store were now shorter by 2 treads than they had been when she first saw them. The men were still at it. It was June, and it was warm, and they were working in the heat of the afternoon, and they were not stopping. James looked at the street. He looked at the buildings being slowly buried to their waist, at the men moving earth, at the wooden steps that were getting shorter as the ground rose around them. He looked at the water line on the brick, the mark of January, which was moving downward relative to the rising street and would eventually be below the surface. Something only the people who had been here in January would remember was there. They are not pretending it did not happen, he said. He said it slowly, working it out as he said it. They are just building above it. She looked at him. The flood is still there, he said. Under the new street. They did not take it away. They just put something over it. Yes, she said. He thought about this. Is that the same as forgetting it? He said. She thought about the ledger she had just bought. The blank pages waiting for the numbers that would constitute the record of whatever came next. She thought about the old ledger under the mud of the kitchen floor, with 9 years of numbers in it that were still true. Still the accurate record of what those years had been, even if they were unreachable. I do not think so, she said. I think it is something else. What? She looked at the street being raised around the buildings that were choosing to stay. I think it is deciding to live above something without pretending the something is not there, she said. James looked at the street for a while longer. Then he looked at his mother. We are doing that too, he said. Are we not? She picked up the reins. Yes, she said. We are. She drove them home through the long June afternoon, the wagon full, the chickens making their small, persistent noise in the crate in the wagon bed, the valley opening out around them as they moved east, the fields still showing in places the marks of what had been in them, the dark lines where the water had been, the places where the soil had the particular color of ground that had been underwater for a long time, the mountains visible in the east, clear in the afternoon light, white still at the high elevations, even in June. She thought about the rocking chair. She thought about walking into the parlor in the days after the water dropped and seeing it there on its rockers, still upright, the mud on it, and the cushion gone, and the wood darkened, but the chair itself standing the way it had always stood. She had sat in it the day the kitchen was clean enough to sit in. She had sat in it, and it had rocked on its rockers with the same motion it had always rocked with. And she had sat in it for a while and thought about her grandmother who had made it in Cork, who had given it to her mother, who had given it to her. 3 women, and this chair, and the distance between Cork and Ohio and Sacramento. The chair had been through more water than any of them. It was still rocking. Daniel was in the north field when they came through the gate. He was on foot, not plowing, just walking the field the way he walked it in the evenings sometimes. He saw the wagon and raised one hand, and she raised one back. James jumped down from the wagon before it stopped and began unloading without being told. The new habit of a boy who had learned over the winter that there was always something that needed doing and that waiting to be told was a way of making it take longer. She watched him for a moment. Then she climbed down and went to find the water bucket, because the chickens would need water before anything else. She had a ledger to start. She had numbers to write. She had April to plan for. And after April, September. And after September, the whole long arithmetic of what came next. The work was there. It had always been there. The winter had not changed that. She picked up the bucket and went to the well. By April, 11 families in the valley had left. Daniel knew this not from any official accounting, but from the particular knowledge of a man who paid attention to his neighbors, which in the Sacramento Valley meant knowing whose chimney was smoking in the morning and whose was not, whose fields were being worked and whose were growing the particular kind of voluntary grass that came up on ground that had been good farmland and was being let go. 11 families. He knew some of them. He knew the Hargroves, whose property sat in the lowest ground for 3 miles in any direction. A family who had been in the valley for 6 years and whose lower floor had been under 5 feet of water for 3 weeks, and whose barn had not survived. He knew the Prendergasts, who had 2 children and a sick mother and a husband who had been saying for 2 years that Sacramento offered more opportunity for a man of his skills, and for whom the flood had been the reason he had needed and had been waiting for, without knowing he was waiting for it. He did not think about them as people who had failed. He knew what it cost to leave. The weight of the decision. The thing you walked away from when you walked away from land. You had worked. He had thought about it himself. In the weeks when Clara's fever was high and the mud work was not going as fast as it needed to go, and Margaret was running numbers on the backs of envelopes that did not come out to the figure they needed. He had thought about it, and he had not said anything about it. Margaret had thought about it too. He knew this the way he knew most things about his wife. Not because she said them, but because she was in the same situation he was in, and he knew her well enough to know when she was thinking about something she had not said yet. They had not talked about it. This was not avoidance. Exactly. It was more that the question was too large to approach directly. Like a river you crossed by finding the stepping stones, rather than wading straight in. You approached it sideways. You talked about the seed, about whether there would be enough spring rain or too much, about the price of wheat, about Clara's improvement, about James and the work he was doing on the barn, about the neighbors who had left and where they had gone and what their properties looked like now. You talked around it until the talking around it became a kind of answer. On a Tuesday morning, in the middle of March, Daniel went out before dawn. He did this sometimes, had done it since before he could remember. The habit of a man who thought better in the dark before the day arranged itself into its ordinary requirements. He went out and he walked the property the way he walked it. East fence line and north field, and south along the drainage ditch, and back to the barn, and then to the kitchen door. He stood at the east fence for a while. The fence was repaired, or most of it. The work James had done through February and March. The new posts set and the wire strung and the fence running east to the property line the way a fence was supposed to run. In November, James had been working this same fence on an ordinary afternoon. Daniel stood at the east fence in the March dark, and he thought about that November afternoon and about the ordinary quality of it, the way nothing about it had indicated what was coming. Nothing ever did. He stood at the fence, and he looked east, toward where the river was, back in its banks, the sound of it audible in the dark when everything else was quiet. The sound he had stopped hearing 9 years ago because it was always there. He was hearing it now. He stood at the fence and heard the river, and then he went back to the house. Margaret was up when he came in, as she usually was when he went out before dawn. She was at the table with the new ledger, not writing in it, looking at the blank pages, the pages that had nothing in them yet, waiting for the numbers that would constitute the record of whatever came next. He sat down. She did not look up. "I walked the east fence," he said. "How is it?" "James did good work." She nodded. He looked at the blank ledger. "The north field is going to be ready by the 3rd week of April," he said. "If the weather holds, if it howls, the south field will need another month." She turned a page in the blank ledger, turned it back. "The Hargrove place has been empty since February," she said. "Yes. Someone will buy it eventually. When the prices come back." "Yes." She smoothed the blank page in front of her. "The Prentice family is staying," she said. "I heard from Mrs. apprentice last week. Henry has already started plowing. I heard that too. She was quiet for a moment. If we plant in the north field on the 17th, she said, and we get a normal summer, and the wheat price holds to September. She paused. She was doing the arithmetic in her head, the way she always did, arithmetic, carefully and without skipping steps. We will not be where we were in November, but we will be somewhere. He looked at the blank ledger. Somewhere is not nothing, he said. She looked up at him then, across the table, across the lamp between them, and he looked at her, and they were quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of two people who had been in the same situation long enough to have developed a way of communicating in the space between words. Clara asked me yesterday if we were going to move, she said. What did you tell her? I told her I did not know yet. He looked at the table. She asked if we could stay. Margaret said. She said she did not want to go somewhere she did not know. She paused. She said California was where she was from. He thought about Clara. 8 years old. Born in this house. Walking this land since she could walk. He thought about what it meant to be from a place. To have the place be the starting point rather than the destination. He thought about himself at 41, who had come here from Ohio at 32, for whom California had always been the destination, the place he had arrived at after the decision to leave. Whether you could ever be from a place you had arrived at was a question he had not thought to ask himself before. Whether Clara was from here was not a question at all. She was from here the way you were from somewhere, when somewhere was the only place you had ever been. He stood up. He went to the window and looked out at the dark yard, at the barn, at the fence line visible in the darkness, at the east fields he could not see, but could locate exactly in his mind, could walk to in the dark without a lamp, because he knew where everything was. He thought about Rosa Velasquez on the fence line that morning in March. 2 weeks ago, the morning he had been checking the drainage ditch, and she had come past on her way to look at what was left of the south pasture. She had stopped at the fence, and they had stood together for a moment, looking at the recovering land, the mud drying now, the first volunteer grass coming up in the low spots. He had said something about the soil, about how the silt the flood left would be good for the wheat. She had looked at the land for a moment without speaking. Then she had said, "My grandfather always said the valley remembered its floods in its soil." She had looked at the far hills, at the edge of where the rancho had once extended. He said the floods were how the valley fed itself. He did not say it like a good thing or a bad thing, just like a fact. She had walked on. He had stood at the fence for a while after she left, looking at the land, thinking about what it meant for a valley to feed itself with its own floods, to use its own catastrophes as the mechanism of its fertility. The wheat they were going to plant in April would grow in the silt of the January water. The harvest they were going to bring in come September would be the floods doing as much as theirs. He came back to the table, and he sat down, and he looked at the blank ledger, and he looked at his wife. Write April 17th at the top of the first page, he said. She looked at him. That is when we start planting, he said. Write it down. She picked up the pen. She wrote the date at the top of the first blank page of the new ledger. April 17th, 1862. And then she put the pen down and looked at what she had written and left it there on the table between them. The date, and the blank page below it. The beginning of the next 9 years. Neither of them said the thing they had been not saying for 3 months. They did not need to. The date was written. That was the answer. Outside. In the barn. In the crate James had built for them. The young chickens made their small noise in the dark. The river made its sound to the east. The stars were out over the valley, over the recovering fields and the repaired fences and the mud still drying in the low places. Over all of it. The lamp burned low between them. Margaret closed the ledger. They went to bed. Clara Colton was 70 years old when she tried to explain the flood to her grandchildren. It was a Sunday afternoon in 1924, and they were sitting on the porch of the house in Sacramento, where she had lived since her husband's death. A house on a street that had not existed in 1862, built on ground that had been farmland in 1862, in a city that was in almost every visible respect unrecognizable from the city that had rowed its governor to his inauguration in a boat. She told them about the field being gone, about the water to the eaves, about the flour bread that tasted like wet paper, and the smell that came on the 4th day, and the orange cat on the moving roof. She told them about Rosa Velasquez rowing through the dark, and her father standing at the window watching the small lamp move south across the water. She told them about the rocking chair still on its rockers in the parlor water, and her mother writing a date at the top of a blank page, and the way the valley looked from the storage room window on the morning the sea finally began to find its edge. Her grandchildren listened. They were good children, and they loved their grandmother, and they listened with the patient attention of children who understood that listening was the thing required of them right now. One of them, a boy of 12, named William, was looking at the street while she talked, at the automobiles moving past, at the electric lights coming on in the early dusk, at the ordinary machinery of a California afternoon in 1924. When she finished, he said, "Was it scary?" She thought about it. "Yes," she said. And then it was something else. Something that did not have a name. What kind of something? She looked at the street, at the automobiles, at the electric lights, the kind you carry, she said. The kind that does not go away, but gets smaller relative to everything that comes after it. William nodded the way 12-year-olds nodded when they were filing information. They did not yet have the experience to fully process. The other children had already moved on to other things. The conversation in the yard. The dog at the gate. The ordinary pulls of a Sunday afternoon. They had listened. They would not remember. This was not their failure. It was the nature of stories that were not attached to anything they could see or touch or stand on. Clara sat on the porch after they went inside, and she thought about this. She had been telling this story for 62 years. She had told it to her children and her grandchildren, and she had told it to neighbors and to the women in her church group, and to a young man from the Sacramento newspaper who had come to her door in 1912 asking about the old days. She had told it every way she knew how to tell it, and she had watched it arrive, and she had watched it not quite land, the way a letter arrived in a house where no one was expecting it. It was not that people did not believe her. They believed her the way they believed things that had happened before they were born, which was to say, they accepted the facts and put them in a category called history and left them there. What they did not do was feel the floor vibrate when the stove slid 6 inches across the kitchen below them in the middle of the night. What they did not do was smell the fourth day. What they did not do was stand at the window and see the field gone, not flooded, gone, replaced by a flat brown sea going to the horizon. She had no way to give them that. She had only the words. And the words were not the thing. The flood of 1861 to 62 was not in any poem Clara knew of. It was not in any song. There was no painting of K Street underwater hanging in a public building where people could walk past it and stop. There were accounts of it in newspapers from the time, accurate accounts. Some of them very well written. But the newspapers of 1862 were in archives now, available to scholars and researchers, and people with specific reasons to go looking. Nobody went looking if they did not already know it was there. There were no photographs. This was the simple fact that underpinned everything else. In 1862, photography existed, but not in the way it would exist 20 years later. Not in the way that produced images of ordinary events as well as extraordinary ones. The flood happened, and people saw it and described what they saw in letters and journals and newspaper accounts, and the descriptions were accurate and vivid and entirely unable to do what a photograph would have done, which was to show the thing itself to people who had not been there. There was no image of the governor rowing to his inauguration, no image of K Street underwater, no image of a miner sitting on a hillside above a flooded camp, no image of Rosa Velasquez in her boat, no image of a family of 5 in a storage room above a drowned farm, eating flour, bread, and listening to the water move through the house below them. Without the image, the thing happened and was recorded and then gradually receded. In the way that things receded when there was nothing to hold them in place in the common memory. The war did not help. January of 1862 was a month that contained, in the Eastern newspapers, dispatches from the front, accounts of battles and troop movements and political arguments about the conduct of the war. And all of this material occupied the space in which the flooding of California might otherwise have been noticed. The people who read the New York papers in January of 1862 were people whose sons and husbands and brothers were in uniform in Virginia and Tennessee. And they were reading about those men. California was very far away, and the men there were not in uniform, and the flood was not the war. California received coverage, but coverage was not the same as being seen. And being seen in a January that also contained the war was difficult for anything that was not the war. And then there was California itself. California had been telling a story about itself since the gold rush. A story that had to do with sunshine and abundance and the particular quality of possibility that the distance from the eastern states seemed to confer on everything that happened there. The story was not false. California was sunny. The land was abundant. The possibilities were real. But the story required a certain amount of selection, an emphasis on the things that confirmed it, and a quiet setting aside of the things that did not, and a flood that turned the Central Valley into a sea for 6 weeks and bankrupted the state and killed the cattle economy and proved that the young state could not protect its own capital city, did not confirm the story. It was easier to rebuild and move on than to tell the story of what had been rebuilt from. Sacramento raised its streets and built above the waterline, and the waterline went underground, and the people who had not been there in January walked above it on their way to the market and the courthouse and the church, and they did not think about what was under their feet, because there was nothing visible to tell them. Clara knew what was under the streets. She had been there. She was 8 years old, and she had sat in a kitchen chair while her mother and father moved mud with flat boards. And she had looked at the kitchen that did not look like their kitchen, and she had understood, with the understanding that came from being inside something, rather than reading about it afterward, that the kitchen would be rebuilt, and the mud would dry, and the normal would return, and that the returning of the normal was also a kind of forgetting you could not eat and sleep and work in a kitchen every day while simultaneously keeping it as a ruined kitchen in your mind. The body moved past it. The days moved past it. The normal was the thing you lived in, and the ruined kitchen was the thing you remembered. And remembering was not living, and life required living. She understood this. She also understood that what had been lost in the forgetting was not trivial. What had been lost was the knowledge of what this land could do, what the river was capable of, what the mountains held in snow, and what they did with it when the winter was wrong. What had been lost was the knowledge that the building of California in those early years had been done on assumptions about the land that the land had not agreed to. The lesson had been paid for. She had paid for it in flour, bread, and the smell of the fourth day, and the sound of the stove sliding across the kitchen floor, and the particular quality of her father's face when he came in from looking at the field that was gone. She had been paying the carrying cost of that lesson for 62 years. The people who came after did not pay. They inherited the levees that were built because of the flood, and the revised understanding of flood zones that came because of the flood, and the changes to how Sacramento was constructed that came because of the flood, and they used these things without knowing where they came from. The way you used a road without thinking about who built it or why it went where it went. The road went where it went because someone had learned, at some cost, that it needed to go there. Clara sat on the porch until the evening came, and the streetlights came on, and the automobiles went home to their garages. The grandchildren were inside now. She could hear them, the sounds of a house with children in it, the particular noise of a Sunday evening winding down. Her daughter would be in the kitchen. There would be supper soon. She looked at the street. She thought about her father at the east fence in the dark before dawn, listening to the river. She thought about her mother writing April 17th in the new ledger. She thought about James beside her at the window, counting the things that floated past. She thought about the orange cat on the moving roof, going south with absolute composure, going wherever it was going. She did not know what had happened to the cat. She had never known. She had been hoping for 62 years that it had found somewhere high and dry, and that it had sat there in the sun when the water went down and cleaned its paws and found its way back to wherever it considered home. She had been hoping this without any evidence either way. She got up from the porch chair and went inside. Her grandson William was at the kitchen table doing his schoolwork, bent over it with the focused inattention of a boy who was doing his work while thinking about something else entirely. She paused in the doorway and looked at him. He looked up. "Grandma," he said, "was there really a flood that covered the whole valley?" She looked at him. "Yes," she said, "like the whole thing, all the farms and everything, all the farms," she said, "all the towns, the capital city, all of it." He thought about this with the genuine curiosity of a 12-year-old encountering something he had not known. "Why do they not teach that in school?" he said. She looked at her grandson for a moment. "That," she said, "is exactly the right question." She went to help with supper. Behind her, William sat at the table and thought about a valley full of water, and a governor in a rowboat, and a whole state that had apparently drowned and been forgotten. And he thought it was one of the more interesting things his grandmother had ever told him. And he thought he might look it up sometime. Then his sister called him from the other room, and he got up to see what she wanted. He did not look it up. He was 12 years old, and there were other things. Clara stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the Sacramento evening, and she thought, I have been carrying this for 62 years, and I cannot put it down, and I cannot hand it to anyone, because no one will take it, and someday, soon I will not be here, and then there will be no one left. Who was there? She thought this without bitterness. It was simply the situation. The water had come and gone, and the city had risen above it, and the people who came after walked above the waterline without knowing it was there, and this was how it was going to be. The only thing you could do was keep telling the story until you could not tell it anymore, and hope that somewhere in the telling something caught. She turned from the window and went to set the table for supper. The wheat came up in May. Not all of it. The south field was still too wet to have taken the seed properly, and the germination there was thin. The kind of stand that would yield something, but not what a full stand would yield. But the north field, the field that Daniel had said would be ready by the 3rd week of April, and that had been ready by the 3rd week of April, came up the way wheat came up when the conditions were right, evenly and green, and with the particular quality of new growth that was different from any other green in the world. Daniel stood at the edge of the north field on a morning in early May and looked at it. He had stood at the edge of this field in November and looked at the wheat that was in the barn and thought, best year yet. He had stood at this field in January and seen water from horizon to horizon. He had stood at this field in March and pressed his hand into the mud and found the fertility still there under the silt. The land willing to go again, if he was willing to ask it. He was asking it. The wheat was answering. He reached down and touched the top of one of the young shoots with his finger. The lightest touch, the way you touch something you did not want to disturb. The shoot bent slightly and then returned to its position. He withdrew his hand. He did not say anything. There was no one to say it to. And some things did not need saying anyway. Clara was well. The fever had left in March and had not returned, and she was herself again, which meant she was asking questions at a rate that exhausted everyone around her, and running across the fields with the energy of a child who had been inside too long and was making up for it. She had asked him, one afternoon when he was working on the drainage ditch, whether the field remembered being underwater. He had thought about this. I do not know that fields remember things, he had said. Everything remembers, Clara said. She was crouching next to the ditch, watching the water move. James says the mud the flood left is good for the wheat. So the flood left something that is like remembering. He had looked at his daughter. That is a reasonable way to think about it, he had said. She had nodded and stood up and gone back to whatever she had been doing. He thought about it now, standing at the edge of the north field. The 2 feet of river silt deposited across his fields in January was the land's record of what had happened. The way the water line on the Sacramento buildings was those buildings' record. The silt was richer than his topsoil had been before. The wheat in the north field was growing in water the land had left behind. The flood was still there, in the ground, in the form of what it had deposited. Clara was right. It was a kind of memory. Margaret was teaching Clara to keep accounts. she had started in April, sitting with her at the table in the evenings, going through the new ledger together, explaining what each entry meant and why it was written the way it was written. Clara was quick with numbers, and she asked the questions that Clara asked, which were thorough and sometimes inconvenient and always worth answering. One evening, Clara had asked why some of the entries on the left side of the page had been crossed out. Margaret had explained that those were entries from a ledger they no longer had, things she had rewritten from memory in the new book. Clara had asked what had happened to the old ledger. Margaret had said it was lost in the flood. Clara had looked at the crossed-out entries, the entries that represented 9 years of careful record, reduced to what one woman could hold in her memory. And she had said, "But you remember all of it." "Most of it," Margaret said. "The important parts." Clara had thought about this. "How do you know which parts are important until after?" she had said. Margaret had looked at her daughter. "You do not," she had said. "You just remember as much as you can and hope the important parts are in there." Clara had accepted this and gone back to the numbers. James fixed the east fence in May. He had fixed it twice already, in February and March, and both times the ground had shifted as it dried, and the posts had gone crooked and needed to be reset. The third time he set them, he dug the holes deeper and packed the earth around the bases with the care of someone who had learned through 2 failures what the job actually required. He was 15 now, or would be in the fall. He worked the farm with a competence that Daniel found himself relying on in ways he had not expected to rely on a son of this age. Not because Daniel was diminished, but because James had grown. There was a morning in May when Daniel was in the barn and James was at the east fence, and he looked across the field at his son, and he thought about the afternoon in November when James had been fixing that same fence on an ordinary day. The last ordinary day, the last day before the rain started, that would not stop for 6 weeks. He thought about what he would have said to his November self if he could have spoken to him across those months. He did not know. There was nothing useful to say. The thing that had happened, and they were on the other side of it. And on the other side of it, the fence was being fixed, and the wheat was coming up, and Clara was well, and Margaret had a new ledger with a date written at the top of the first page. Not unchanged, not the same farm or the same family they had been in November. Changed in the ways that things were changed when they went through something rather than around it. Changed in the way of the rocking chair that was still on its rockers but dark with water and without its cushion. Still on its rockers, he went back to work. There are things beneath California that do not show on any map. The old riverbeds, the channels that the Sacramento and the San Joaquin and the American and the Feather cut through the valley floor over centuries, filling with sediment and shifting course and filling again, leaving behind the particular substrate of a valley that was built by water and has always known it. The aquifers, the underground reservoirs that the farms and cities of the present draw from. Water that in some cases has been in the ground since before there were people to need it. The silt layers, the deposits from every flood the valley has experienced in the 10,000 years since the last ice age. Each flood leaving its record in the ground, the way years left rings in a tree. The flood of 1861 to 62 left a layer. It is there in the soil of the Sacramento Valley. A band of fine river sediment at a depth that corresponds to a winter 160 years ago, identifiable by its composition and the organic material in it and its position relative to the layers above and below. Geologists have found it. They know it is there. They know what it represents. They have also found older layers that correspond to floods before 1861, floods in the 1700s, floods in the 1600s, floods before the Spanish came, before the missions, before the ranchos, before the gold rush, before California was a name for a place. Floods that left their records in the ground in the same way, readable by people who know how to read them. The valley has flooded before, many times, at intervals of decades or centuries. In years when the atmospheric conditions over the Pacific produced columns of water vapor thousands of miles long, carrying more moisture than the Mississippi River, aimed at the California coast, releasing their contents over the mountains and the valley for days or weeks at a time. The geologic record does not use the word disaster. The geologic record is not interested in whether the people in the valley were ready. It simply notes that the water came and left its layer, and that above the layer came more sediment and more layers, and eventually more water and more layers. Each one a record of a thing that happened and was absorbed into the ground, while the people above it went on with their lives. Scientists at the United States Geological Survey have modeled what a storm of the same magnitude as 1861 to 62 would do to California today. They call the scenario the arc storm. They have published it. They have presented it to planners and engineers and emergency managers. It is available to anyone who goes looking for it. They do not treat it as fantasy. They study the layers in the valley floor, and they say the atmosphere has done this before. And they say the water does not know that we have built things here since the last time. Daniel Colton sat on the back step of his house on an evening in September of 1862. The North Field was harvested. Not a full harvest. Not what November 1861 had held in the barn, but a harvest, real wheat, cut and stored. The first real number on the credit side of the new ledger. The first entry that pointed toward rather than away from where they needed to be. He sat on the back step and he listened to the American River. He listened to it the way he had learned to listen to it, which was differently from how he had listened before January. Before January, he had listened to it without thinking about it. The ambient sound of a river that was always where it was supposed to be. A background to everything else. He had stopped hearing it as a sound and started hearing it as a condition. The way you stopped hearing your own house when you had lived in it long enough. He heard it now. He heard it every morning and every evening. He heard it when he was at the east fence, and when he was in the north field, and sometimes at night when the house was quiet. He did not hear it as a threat. He did not hear it as a promise. He heard it as information. The way you heard things that you had learned, at some cost, to pay attention to. The river was at its normal September level, low and clear, running quietly over the stones that the winter's floods had rearranged. The sound it made was the ordinary sound of an ordinary river in ordinary time. He had learned to know the difference. Margaret came to the door behind him. She stood in the doorway with the lamp in her hand, the light falling past him onto the step in the yard. And he did not turn around. "Supper," she said. In a minute, she waited, After a while, she came and sat on the step beside him. She set the lamp next to her, and it lit the small space between them. They listened to the river together. It was a good harvest, she said. Better than I thought it would be in March. The north field always does well. The south field will be better next year. The silt. She was quiet for a moment. Clara wants to name the new cattle, she said. I know. She has already named them. She told me the names this afternoon. She wanted me to tell you so you could not say no. He almost smiled. What are the names? January, Margaret said, and April. He sat with that for a moment. January and April. The month the water came, and the month they planted. His 8-year-old daughter's accounting of the year. Reduced to 2 words. Attached to 2 animals. Made permanent. In the way that names made things permanent. Those are fine names, he said. The river moved in the dark. The lamp burned between them on the step. The house was quiet behind them. Clara asleep. James somewhere in the back of the house doing what James did in the evenings now, which was prepare for tomorrow. He thought about what was in the ground beneath his fields. The silt from the flood, the layer they were farming on top of. The way you walked on a floor without thinking about what was under it. He thought about the layers below that. The floods before this one. The records that the valley kept of every water it had held. He thought about the river at its normal September level. Ordinary and quiet, and exactly where it was supposed to be. The river did not remember January. Or it remembered it the way rivers remembered things. In the rearranged stones of the bed. In the new channel, it had cut through the south end of the property. In the debris caught in the high branches of the cottonwoods along the bank, the river had moved on. It was doing what it did, carrying the water that came to it from the mountains toward the delta and the bay and the ocean, fulfilling its function with the complete absence of concern for what it had done in January or what it might do in some future January when the conditions were wrong again. He looked at the water he could not see in the dark. He thought about the 80 acres. He thought about the November version of the farm and the January version and the March version and the September version. 4 different farms in the same place. And he thought about what was true about all 4 of them. The thing that remained constant through the flood and the mud and the recovery and the first tentative harvest. And what he thought was true was this. The land was still there, changed, silted over, rearranged in its lower parts. But there, the same 80 acres, the land did not remember him. He knew that. He had no illusions about what the land thought of his 9 years on it. The land was not keeping a ledger, but he remembered the land, every acre of it, every variation in the soil, every low spot and high spot, and the particular quality of each field in each season. He carried it the way he carried the things he had paid for, with enough of himself that they became part of how he knew who he was. The water had come. The water had gone. He was still here. He thought about the people who would farm this land after him, the children and the grandchildren and the people he would never know, the people who would walk this ground in years he could not imagine. He thought about what they would know about January of 1862. He thought they would not know much. He thought the flood would be a thing that happened before they were born, if they knew about it at all. He thought they would walk on the silt layer without knowing it was there. He wanted to tell them something. He did not know how. He could not write them a letter the way he had written Margaret letters from California, describing what the land looked like and what he thought it could become. All he could do was the thing he was doing, which was staying and working and planting and harvesting and maintaining the fence and listening to the river and remembering what the river was capable of even when it sounded like it had forgotten. Margaret put her hand on his arm. He looked at her. She was looking at the dark where the field was. The September field, with the harvest in the barn and the ground resting before the fall plowing. She was looking at it the way she looked at numbers in the ledger, with the complete attention of someone reading something that had useful information in it. Same field next year, she said. Same field, he said. She picked up the lamp. Come in, she said. The supper is getting cold. He got up from the step. He stood for a moment in the September dark, in the smell of the dry field and the river and the September air that was the smell of this land in this season, the smell he had been smelling for 9 years and would smell for however many more years there were. He listened to the river. Then he went inside. The door closed behind him. Outside, the river moved in the dark, the way rivers moved, without stopping, without memory, without any concern for what was on its banks, or what had been on its banks, or what would be. The water went where it went. The land held what it held, and beneath the fields of the Sacramento Valley, beneath the roads and the towns and the cities that were coming, beneath all the weight of what would be built on this ground in the years ahead, the layer was there, the flood layer, the record of a winter that had covered this valley from the mountains to the coast ranges, that had drowned the capital and silenced the telegraph lines and ended the cattle economy and sent 11 families to their wagons and kept one family in their upper floor for 11 days, eating flour bread while the rocking chair rocked. In the water below them, the layer was there. It would always be there, patient and still and completely without interest in whether anyone above it knew it existed. The water does not remember you, but you have to remember the water.